Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. Last Tuesday, I had an experience that still makes my skin crawl. I was driving home from visiting my parents in Tucson, heading back to my apartment in a quiet neighborhood just outside Phoenix, when I spotted my childhood friend Danny waiting at a bus stop. The afternoon sun was brutal, and there was a decent crowd of people waiting, so I figured the bus was running late. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I called out. Danny's face lit up with relief. "Man, yes, I've been standing here for 40 minutes. As he walked toward my car, I noticed he'd been talking to an older man, probably in his mid-40s, thin build, wearing a simple button-down shirt and jeans. The guy had been watching our interaction pretty intently. And when Danny got in my car, this stranger was still staring at us through the passenger window. "Hey," I said to Danny, "should we offer that guy a ride too? I'm heading to the metro station anyway." Danny's reaction caught me completely off guard. His whole demeanor changed instantly. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice sharp and serious. "Drive now." I was taken aback by his tone. Danny's usually the most laid-back person I know, but he sounded genuinely frightened. "What's wrong?" I asked as I pulled away from the curb. "Do you know that guy?" "His name is Marcus Webb," Danny said, glancing back to make sure we were out of sight. "And yeah, I know him. Everyone in my neighborhood knows him. He's bad news, man, like seriously bad." I thought Danny was being dramatic, but as we drove, he told me a story that made my blood run cold. Marcus had moved into Danny's neighborhood about 18 months earlier. The area is mostly long-time residents, families who have lived there for decades, people who know each other's business and look out for each other's kids. When a stranger moves in, especially someone with no obvious connections to the community, people notice. At first, Marcus seemed harmless enough. He was quiet, kept to himself, and didn't cause any problems. He'd rented a small house from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who'd been trying to find a reliable tenant for years. The house had been sitting empty for a while and was starting to look rundown. So neighbors were actually happy to see someone move in and take care of it. Marcus did fix the place up a bit. Nothing major, but he painted the exterior, cleaned up the yard, and made it look occupied again. What struck people as odd was how he seemed to be trying to draw attention to the house. He'd sit on the front porch for hours, always ready with a friendly wave or a conversation starter when people walked by. Twice a week, Marcus would set up a small business selling shoes from his front yard. He'd lay out blankets and display dozens of pairs, sneakers, boots, dress shoes, all in surprisingly good condition. He told people he bought them wholesale and was just trying to make a little extra money. Danny had been tempted to check out the selection one afternoon. He'd been looking for work boots, and Marcus's prices seemed reasonable. But when he approached the house, Marcus became unusually insistent about inviting him inside to see more inventory. "It was weird," Danny explained. "Most people selling stuff from their yard want to keep the transaction outside, you know. But this guy really wanted me to come into his house. He kept saying he had better shoes inside, that I should take a look around." Danny had made an excuse about being in a hurry, but Marcus's persistence had made him uncomfortable. There was something about the man's eagerness that felt wrong. A few weeks later, Danny was talking to Mr. Rodriguez, an older neighbor who'd lived on the street for 30 years. Rodriguez mentioned that he'd walked past Marcus's house one evening and noticed something strange through one of the windows. What looked like animal cages stacked along one wall. Lots of them, Rodriguez had said, and I could hear animals inside, but not like pets, more like farm animals, chickens maybe. This struck both men as odd, since the neighborhood had strict rules about livestock, and Marcus's yard was way too small for any kind of farming operation. The truth came out about 2 months ago. Mrs. Patterson had gotten a call from other neighbors complaining about a terrible smell coming from her rental property. When she went to investigate, she found something that made her immediately call the police. The house was filled with dead chickens, not just a few dozens of them in various states of decomposition. Many had been dismembered or appeared to have been killed in ritualistic ways. The smell was so overpowering that the officers who responded had to wear masks. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the back bedroom, they found what could only be described as an altar. The walls, ceiling, and floor were covered in symbols painted in what forensics later confirmed was animal blood. Candles were arranged in specific patterns around the room, and there were statues and figurines of various occult figures, some depicting death deities, others representing darker spiritual entities. The centerpiece was a large shrine dedicated to what appeared to be Santa Muerte, the Mexican folk saint associated with death and the underworld. But there were other figures that even the investigating officers couldn't identify, twisted, grotesque representations that seemed designed to invoke fear rather than worship. Marcus had disappeared before the police arrived, taking nothing with him but leaving behind this macabre scene. Mrs. Patterson was horrified, not just by what had been done to her property, but by the realization that she'd unknowingly harbored someone involved in what appeared to be dark occult practices. The cops said it looked like he'd been doing this stuff the whole time he lived there, Danny told me. All those times he was trying to get people to come inside. They think he was looking for victims. The investigation revealed that Marcus had a history. He'd been run out of at least 2 other communities in Arizona and New Mexico for similar activities. Always the same pattern. He'd move into a quiet neighborhood, set up some kind of small business to draw people to his house, then try to lure individuals inside for purposes that were never entirely clear, but were obviously sinister. The detective told Mr. Rodriguez that they think Marcus was trying to recruit people for some kind of cult activity, Danny continued. Or maybe he was planning to hurt people and use them in his rituals. Either way, anyone who went into that house alone was probably in serious danger. As we sat in traffic, I found myself thinking about how normal Marcus had looked at the bus stop. There was nothing about his appearance that would have suggested he was involved in anything dark or dangerous. He could have been anyone, an office worker, a contractor, someone's uncle. So where is he now? I asked. Nobody knows, Danny replied. He just vanished. But here's the thing that really freaks me out. People have been seeing him around town. Just yesterday, my neighbor said she saw him at the grocery store. Another friend spotted him at a gas station last week. He's still here, somewhere. I dropped Danny off at his apartment, and drove home with a chill running down my spine. The idea that someone like Marcus could blend so seamlessly into a community, could present himself as a harmless neighbor while harboring such dark intentions, was terrifying. That night I called my father and told him about the encounter. My dad has lived in Arizona his whole life and has seen his share of strange people and situations. His response was immediate and serious. "Stay away from that man," he said. "I don't care if you see him stranded on the side of the road in the middle of the desert. Don't stop, don't help, don't engage with him at all. People like that, they're not just criminals. They're something else entirely." My father went on to explain that he'd encountered people involved in similar practices over the years. Individuals who seemed to be connected to networks of people practicing what could only be described as malevolent witchcraft or dark spiritualism. "It's not just about the animal sacrifice," he said. "People like that are looking for power, and they're willing to hurt others to get it. They prey on kindness, on people's natural instinct to help. That's how they find their victims." The conversation left me deeply unsettled. I kept thinking about how close I'd come to offering Marcus a ride, how easily I could have found myself alone in a car with someone who might have meant me harm. I also couldn't stop thinking about the other people waiting at that bus stop. Ordinary people just trying to get home from work or run errands. Did they know they were standing next to someone potentially dangerous? How many other Marcus Webbs are out there, hiding in plain sight? The experience has changed how I think about the concept of neighborly kindness. I still believe in helping people when I can, but I've learned to trust my instincts more. If something feels off about a situation or a person, there's probably a good reason for that feeling. Danny later told me that the police had asked residents to report any sightings of Marcus, and that they'd found evidence suggesting he might be involved with a larger network of people practicing similar rituals in communities across the Southwest. The investigation was ongoing, but Marcus remained at large. 2 weeks after our encounter, I was driving through that same area when I saw police cars surrounding a different house, about 5 miles from where Marcus had been living. Later, I learned that another rental property had been discovered with similar evidence: dead animals, occult symbols, and signs of ritualistic activity. The tenant had disappeared just like Marcus, leaving behind only questions and the lingering fear that somewhere out there, people like this are still looking for their next opportunity, their next community to infiltrate, their next victim to target. I've started paying more attention to my own neighborhood, to the people who live around me and the strangers who pass through. Not out of paranoia, but out of awareness. Sometimes the most dangerous neighbors are the ones who work hardest to appear normal, who go out of their way to seem friendly and helpful while harboring intentions that are anything but neighborly. The thought that still haunts me most is this: if Danny hadn't been there to warn me, I would have offered Marcus that ride without a second thought. I would have been alone in my car with him for at least 20 minutes, probably making friendly conversation, completely unaware of the danger I was in. Sometimes being a good neighbor means knowing when not to help, when to listen to that inner voice that tells you something isn't right. In a world where most people are genuinely decent, it's easy to forget that predators exist, and that they often disguise themselves as the very people we're most inclined to trust. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I live in a small apartment complex in downtown Phoenix, Arizona. It's one of those older buildings from the 1970s where the walls are thin and you know more about your neighbors than you'd like to. The story I'm about to tell you is about the woman who lived directly below me, in apartment 2B. Her name was Cecilia, though I only learned that after everything happened. For the 3 years I lived above her, she was just the crazy lady downstairs to my roommate Jake and me. Cecilia was probably in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, and she had this way of making everyone in the building uncomfortable. She'd covered all her windows with sheets of cardboard and plywood, creating this fortress-like appearance that made her apartment look abandoned. When anyone offered to help her carry groceries or packages, she'd snap at them with such venom that people eventually stopped trying. She'd accuse us of walking too loudly, of running our dishwasher at unreasonable hours, of conspiring against her in ways that made no sense. The strangest complaint came during monsoon season. She actually knocked on our door one evening, furious, claiming that Jake and I were using our cell phones to make it rain whenever she hung her laundry outside. She stood there in our doorway, dead serious, explaining how we were controlling the weather with our devices. That's when I started wondering if she might be dealing with some kind of mental illness. The smell started becoming an issue around October of 2019. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was the kind of stench that made you gag when you walked past her door. We suspected she was hoarding, and sure enough, cockroaches began appearing throughout the building. They'd crawl under doors, through vents, everywhere. The landlord received multiple complaints, but Cecilia never answered when he knocked. The paranormal activity began in late November, right around Thanksgiving. At first, it was subtle things that you could easily dismiss. A coffee mug would be in a different spot than where I'd left it. Books would fall off shelves for no apparent reason. Strange scratching sounds would come from inside the walls, usually late at night. Jake and I didn't see Cecilia for weeks. Her mail started piling up outside her door, bills, advertisements, packages from online orders. We figured she'd gone to stay with family for the holidays, which seemed out of character, but not impossible. Then on a Tuesday night in late January, all the mail was suddenly gone. Someone had collected it, so we assumed she'd returned. That same night, around 2 a.m, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when something heavy slammed against my bedroom wall. The impact was so forceful that it knocked a framed photo off my nightstand. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and searched the room. My sneakers were lying in the middle of the floor, still rocking back and forth from the impact. But that was impossible. I'd left them in my closet, on a shelf at least 4 feet away from where they'd hit the wall. Someone would have had to throw them with considerable force to make them travel that distance and create such a loud bang. I barely slept that night, but somehow I managed to drift off around dawn. The next day, I was telling Jake about what happened when our bathroom door, which had been propped open, suddenly began to swing shut. We both watched it close completely, and then I jokingly said, "Okay, very funny. Now open it back up." The door immediately swung open. There was no air conditioning running, no windows open, No logical explanation for why a door would close and then open on command. Jake and I just stared at each other, not sure what to make of it. By Friday, I told my buddies Marcus and Tony about the weird stuff happening in the apartment. They came over that afternoon, more curious than scared. My mom had mentioned that while we were out that morning, she'd heard a tremendous crash from our storage closet. When she investigated, she found that a heavy toolbox had somehow fallen from its shelf. A toolbox that would take 2 people to lift and move. Later that evening, while we were all hanging out, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from apartment 2C, right next to Cecilia's place. She looked distressed and explained that the smell coming from Cecilia's apartment had become unbearable. She was going to call the police. That's when Tony, being the joker he is, dared Marcus to knock on Cecilia's door as we walked past it. Marcus did it, pounding on the door several times, but there was no response. We laughed it off and I walked him downstairs to the parking lot. When I got back upstairs, the police had arrived. They'd knocked on Cecilia's door multiple times with no answer, and after Mrs. Rodriguez explained the situation, they called the fire department. The firefighters went around to the small courtyard behind the building, where they could access one of Cecilia's bedroom windows. The moment they pried that window open, the smell hit us like a physical wall. If you've never smelled human decomposition, there's no way to prepare you for it. It's not just strong, it's wrong in a way that makes every instinct in your body scream. Combined with the rotting food and accumulated garbage in her apartment, it was like being punched in the face by death itself. The firefighters called it in immediately. Cecilia was there, in her bed, and she'd been dead for months. The coroner estimated she died sometime in late November, right around the time the strange occurrences in my apartment had begun. Everything clicked. The moved objects, the slamming sounds, the door opening and closing on command. It had all started when Cecilia passed away. Despite how terribly she'd treated everyone in the building, I couldn't help but feel that she'd been trying to get our attention, trying to let someone know that she was alone and needed help. The smell lingered for over a week, even after they removed her body and her family came to clean out the apartment. One of the paramedics gave us some tips for dealing with the odor, but it didn't really go away until Cecilia's niece and nephew finished clearing out all the rotting food and garbage. After the cleaning was done, the paranormal activity stopped completely. It was as if Cecilia's spirit had finally moved on once her physical remains were properly taken care of. Her family told us she'd been battling cancer and had become increasingly isolated from them over the past few years. They tried to check on her, but she'd stopped answering her phone or door long before she died. For several months, everything was quiet. Then December rolled around, almost a year after Cecilia's death, and we started hearing things again. Footsteps from the empty apartment below, the sound of furniture being moved around, soft knocking sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls. It only happened in December, around the anniversary of when she died. It was as if Cecilia returned to that apartment every year, to the place where she'd spent her final months alone and afraid. The new tenants who eventually moved in never stayed long, 3 different families in 2 years, all complaining about strange noises and cold spots. I moved out of that building eventually, but I still drive by sometimes. The apartment where Cecilia died remains empty, with a for rent sign that never seems to come down. Maybe some places hold onto their ghosts, and maybe some people never really leave the places where they suffered most. I learned something important from that experience. Sometimes the most difficult neighbors are the ones who need compassion the most. Cecilia spent her final months in isolation, too proud or too afraid to ask for help, even as she was dying alone. Her paranormal visits weren't meant to scare us. They were her final, desperate attempts to make human contact, to let someone know she existed and that she mattered. Even now, whenever I hear about elderly neighbors who seem antisocial or difficult, I think of Cecilia. I wonder if there's something more going on beneath the surface, some pain or fear that's making them push everyone away. Sometimes being a good neighbor means reaching out even when someone seems to want to be left alone. Because the people who seem to want isolation the most are often the ones who need connection the most. I spent 2.5 months living in a small apartment complex in Tucson, Arizona, back in 2004. I was there to settle my late aunt's estate. She'd been like a second mother to me. And when she passed without any children of her own, she left me her house and most of her belongings. But Arizona probate law required me to be present for multiple court hearings. So I rented a furnished studio in this little complex while I waited for the legal process to run its course. The complex was called Desert Gardens, though there wasn't much garden to speak of, just a few hardy palm trees and some crushed gravel landscaping. It sat right next to a much larger apartment building, one of those 1970s concrete blocks that housed maybe 60 families. Our little complex only had 6 units, arranged in a U-shape around a small parking area. When I first arrived, the landlord, a friendly guy named Ray who lived on site with his wife, showed me around and mentioned something that stuck with me. "Just so you know," he said as we stood in the parking area, "Unit 3 is vacant right now. But if you ever see a car parked in space 3, just ignore it. Don't worry about it. Don't try to talk to whoever might be in it. Just go about your business." I found this odd, but not alarming. I figured maybe it was some kind of ongoing dispute with a former tenant, or maybe someone from the big apartment building next door occasionally used the space illegally. Ray seemed like a reasonable guy, so I assumed he had his reasons for wanting to avoid confrontation. For the first month, I never saw anything unusual. I'd come and go at all hours, sometimes returning from late dinners or early morning court appearances, and parking space 3 always sat empty. Then on a Tuesday night in late June, I was walking back from the corner store around 10 o'clock. As I approached the complex, I heard the distinct sound of a car engine, but not a modern engine. This was the deep, rumbling sound of something old and not well maintained. The kind of car that sounded like it was held together with duct tape and prayers. I was fumbling for my keys when headlights suddenly blazed behind me, illuminating the entire parking area. The engine's sound grew louder, more labored, and I could tell the car was right behind me. I found my keys, opened the main gate, and stepped inside, expecting to see one of my neighbors pulling in. But when I turned around, the headlights were pointing directly at parking space 3. The engine was still running, that distinctive, struggling sound, but I couldn't make out the details of the car because the headlights were too bright. Then without warning, everything went silent. The engine cut out mid-rumble, the headlights vanished, and I was standing in complete darkness. No car doors slamming, no footsteps, no voices. Just absolute silence and an empty parking space where those headlights had been shining. I stood there for a full minute, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but there was nothing there. All the other residents' cars were parked in their usual spots, and Space 3 was completely empty. I'm pretty social by nature, so I didn't have any trouble approaching Maria, one of my neighbors, the next day. I mentioned that I'd seen something strange in the parking area, and before I could even describe what happened, she asked, "Was it parking Space 3?" When I nodded, she invited me to sit on her porch and told me what other residents had experienced. "I've lived here for almost 10 years, she said, "and I've probably seen that car 5 or 6 times. Always the same sound, always the same headlights, always disappears the same way." She described exactly what I'd heard. The engine that sounded like it was on its last legs, the sudden silence, the empty parking space. But she'd actually seen the car itself once, when she'd been coming home from a late shift at the hospital where she worked. It was this old sedan from the 70s, she told me. A Dodge Dart, I think, but in terrible condition. Rust everywhere, paint completely faded. But here's the thing that really got to me. I could see the headlights and the shape of the car, but I couldn't see anyone inside it. Not even a silhouette. Maria explained that Ray had told her the car's history. The vehicle had belonged to an elderly man who'd lived in the big apartment building next door. His name was Walter, and he'd been friends with Ray's father, who'd owned the complex before Ray took it over. Walter had been dealing with some kind of chronic illness, and when the spaces in his own building's parking garage filled up, Ray's father had let him use Space 3 as a courtesy. Ray remembers that car from when he was a kid, Maria said. Same engine sound, same beat-up appearance. Walter drove it for years, always parking in that same spot when he needed to. Then one day, Walter passed away in his apartment. Ray never found out what happened to the car, whether Walter's family sold it, donated it, or what. But a few months after Walter died, that's when people started seeing the car again. She paused, looking thoughtful. The thing is, it's not scary or threatening or anything. It just shows up, parks in Walter's old spot, and then disappears. Like he's still following his old routine, you know, still coming home from wherever he used to go. I lived in that complex for another 6 weeks, and I never saw the phantom car again. But I found myself thinking about Walter and his old Dodge Dart, about the power of habit and routine, about how the things we do every day can become so much a part of us that maybe, in some way, we keep doing them even after we're gone. Maybe that's all ghosts really are, not souls trapped between worlds, but the echoes of the daily patterns that made up a life, still playing out in the places where someone once felt at home. Before I tell you this unsettling story, let me tell you a little about myself and the environment where I live. I reside in a fairly quiet and peaceful neighborhood, somewhat removed from the hustle and bustle of the city, about 45 minutes by car from the nearest busy urban area. While it's not officially declared an agricultural zone, here in the surroundings there are some small family farms and many lush trees, and extensive cultivated lands that give a distinctively more rural and serene air to the entire area. It's also a place where wildlife abounds considerably. And I personally really love going out for walks along the streets and paths where, by the way, conventional sidewalks don't exist. So I usually walk carefully along one side of the road, making routes that vary between 3/4 of a mile to a mile and a half approximately. And then I simply return home. It's quite rare for me to encounter any other person during my walk. Only occasionally, very sporadically, I meet someone walking their dog, doing some exercise, or some similar activity. There's also a relatively nearby park that's usually completely deserted almost all the time. So sometimes when I'm looking for a bit more solitude, I go there and then start the journey back. Now, the story I want to tell you in detail occurred one evening while I was returning from work a little later than usual. Since fall was beginning and, as is natural, the day was getting noticeably shorter with each passing day. That particular evening, I left my house as usual and walked toward the park that was a little more than half a mile away. When I was coming back, completely immersed in my thoughts, I heard a fairly strange noise that seemed to come from the space between two houses. There was a good stretch of vacant land there with some scattered trees and quite a few overgrown bushes. It was practically nighttime by then, so it was somewhat dark and visibility was reduced. But I thought I could make out that something of considerable size was moving stealthily behind one of the larger trees. This naturally caught my attention powerfully and generated intense curiosity in me. So I stopped for an instant and looked toward that area with great attention, trying to sharpen my sight. At first, I saw absolutely nothing out of the ordinary, and although I continued observing, I didn't perceive anything unusual. But then suddenly, I noticed a man who was watching me fixedly from behind a thick tree trunk. This struck me as extremely strange and somewhat alarming because I definitely didn't know him. Moreover, he didn't seem at all like he lived in the area, since I had never seen him around these parts before. The man quickly crouched down, almost hiding when he realized I was looking at him directly, and this furtive behavior left me quite uneasy and with a strange feeling in my body. So I decided without thinking twice to continue on my way home at a somewhat quicker pace. That particular night, I arrived home without major problems, fortunately. But the next day when I went out for my usual walk, I saw that same guy again. However, this time he was in a neighbor's yard, hiding suspiciously behind a fairly thick bush. On this occasion, I felt much more uncomfortable and alarmed than the previous night, so I didn't even stop to look at him carefully and continued walking with the greatest naturalness I could manage. Luckily, that night, I also managed to return home without any unpleasant incident. But on the third consecutive day, when I went to the park again, I saw that the man was lurking around the area once more with an erratic attitude. He was the only person present there, which actually didn't surprise me too much since the park is usually practically empty all the time, as I had mentioned earlier. In that specific opportunity, I saw him approaching stealthily to the forest that borders one of the park's limits. And this seemed extremely suspicious to me and set off all my internal alarms. I realized immediately that I had to get out of there as soon as possible, especially since I was already deeply regretting having gone out for a walk that particular night. So I left the park at that very instant without looking back. But only a couple of minutes passed, maybe 3, before I started to clearly hear footsteps behind me. They were somewhat distant, it's true, but that night There was an almost absolute silence in the environment, so it was very easy to hear them clearly. He seemed to be about 70 feet behind me, more or less. And when I finally mustered the courage and looked back, boom, there he was again, following me, now a bit closer than before, which chilled my blood. I tried not to think too much about it, to convince myself it was a coincidence, and I continued on my way home, although I was genuinely a little uneasy and scared, wondering if he was really following me, or if it was just an unfortunate coincidence. I had no idea what that guy wanted or where exactly he was heading. But several long and anxious minutes passed, and I kept feeling his ominous presence right behind me, stalking me. I could have called the police at that moment. I seriously considered it. But let's be completely honest. I had no concrete proof that he was doing anything really wrong or that he had dark intentions toward me. He was just a guy walking persistently behind me, and that's it. For a moment, I just hoped with all my heart that the guy would go into someone's yard and finally disappear from my sight. But unfortunately, that's not what happened. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I reached my street, and the guy was still there behind me, maintaining the same constant prudential distance. Then I accelerated my pace a bit more, making enormous efforts not to suddenly start running like a madman, until I finally reached the entrance to my house. However, I have to mention that the driveway to my house is quite long, several meters, so I still didn't feel completely safe, much less seeing that the guy continued walking about 20 meters behind me without deviating. I walked even faster down the entrance path and tried to relieve myself a little, naively hoping he would continue on his way down the main street. But when I was about to set foot on the front porch, I thought I could clearly hear him coming directly toward me, shortening the distance. I started looking for my keys at full speed, rummaging through my pockets desperately, trembling so much that it cost me enormously to manage to insert them and open the door. I could hear his footsteps getting closer and closer, and it seemed like now he was really hurrying, almost running. Finally, after a few seconds that felt eternal, I managed to open my door, slammed it shut quickly, and turned the lock with trembling hands. Just a couple of seconds later, no more, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning slowly from outside. He was right outside, on the other side of my door, and I, scared to the core, ran frantically to the other part of the house, as far as possible from the entrance. I waited there for several minutes, holding my breath, trying to listen for any suspicious noise outside. And after a considerable time without hearing absolutely anything, I approached the front window very cautiously. To my immense relief, the guy had completely disappeared. I looked through several more windows of the house, scrutinizing every corner, but there wasn't the slightest trace of him. After that terrifying night, I wisely decided it was better to take a long break from my usual evening walks. I didn't know who that guy was or what he wanted from me, but since then, fortunately, I never saw him again. However, a few days after my disturbing and chilling encounter with him, a series of burglaries were reported in several houses in the area. And although I had no concrete proof of it, I was almost completely sure that this strange and sinister individual had something to do with those crimes. The thought that he might have been casing houses, including mine, sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't made it inside in time, or if he had found a way to get in. The memory of that door handle turning still haunts me to this day, and I've made sure to upgrade my home security system significantly since then. Some time ago, my partner and I made the important decision to buy a house that captivated us deeply from the first moment we laid eyes on it. It had a small and charming creek that ran gently through the backyard, creating an atmosphere of peace, and we both thought in amazement, "My God, who in their right mind wouldn't want to live in such an incredibly beautiful and serene place like this?" We had barely moved in and were unpacking boxes when our neighbor from the adjacent house, an older woman who we later learned was named Martha, came to formally introduce herself. She suddenly appeared at our door with an effusive hello. "My name is Martha, and I'm your neighbor next door. Delighted to meet you." And just like that, without further preamble, we started chatting a bit about trivial things. The conversation was, to be honest, somewhat strange and even a little uncomfortable at times. And when she finally left, I looked at my partner, and we both commented between nervous laughter about how extremely odd that first encounter had been. The next day we took it upon ourselves to look more carefully toward her garden. And to our complete and absolute surprise, we discovered it was completely filled with horrible and unsightly plastic flowers in garish colors that are frankly in terrible taste. So without hesitation, we decided to remove them from our site immediately. Who in their right mind wants to have that type of polluting plastic in their own home? After removing them all with some effort, we began enthusiastically devising a new and much more natural garden design for our space. The next morning, very early, while we were carrying out the first tasks to significantly improve our garden, Martha came out of her house and, as if nothing had happened, began talking to us again with her peculiar style. She had a very particular and subtle way of asking questions that inevitably left you thinking and reflecting on what you had just said. I mean, she was incredibly good at extracting personal information in such a disguised and cunning way that before I realized it, I had already told her a bunch of intimate details about my life practically, without noticing it. Little by little, as the days passed, my husband and I noticed with growing alarm that her house was literally full of dogs. Many, many dogs, and those canines were a real and constant headache for us. Every time night came and we turned off all the lights to try to sleep, the dogs would start barking incessantly and scandalously, regardless of what time it was. After a while enduring this situation, we realized with bitterness that Martha's apparent initial kindness had a hidden and selfish purpose. What she really wanted was to win our friendship so that we wouldn't formally complain about the infernal noise of her pets. So one day, with all the kindness and diplomacy I could muster, I politely asked her to please keep her dogs a little further away from our window, especially during the night. However, she simply smiled in a strange and enigmatic way and told me categorically that she wouldn't do that at all. Then she turned around abruptly and left, leaving me speechless. From that precise day, the barking became even worse, if that was possible, and she began crossing certain coexistence boundaries that before, at least, she hadn't dared to cross. Sometimes it was as if she sneaked into our garden and took my gardening tools without permission, which then appeared in strange places. I also began to notice with concern that all the beautiful flowers I planted with such care seemed to wither and die out of nowhere, inexplicably. And although I never saw her directly doing it, I knew in my heart, with disturbing certainty, that she had to do with all of that, which seemed quite sinister and disturbing to me. Martha seemed to be constantly watching every movement I made, and I was already starting to seriously feel that she was deliberately harassing me. But the strangest and most bewildering thing of all was that my husband never seemed too bothered by her behavior. When I finally told him with anguish everything that was happening and how I felt, he didn't quite believe me at first. In fact, he thought I was just exaggerating things a little, and that I should calm down and not give it so much importance. However, one day he arrived home without his car, thinking he would be completely alone and peaceful. But upon arriving, he heard someone insistently knocking on the door, and when he opened it, he found a bag full of dog excrement right at the entrance of our house. It was there, at that precise and unpleasant moment, when he finally realized that I wasn't exaggerating anything at all, and that she was truly a very disturbing and malicious person. Shortly after this incident, we met another neighbor who lived on the other side of our property. And when we cautiously asked her about Martha, this new neighbor began telling me endless terrible stories of how Martha had been bothering and tormenting other neighbors in the neighborhood for many, many years, to the point that several of them had finally decided to move to escape from her. Among them, to our surprise, was the previous owner of our own house. It was a situation of complete madness, and we began to feel truly trapped in an authentic neighborhood mess with no apparent way out. So after much deliberation, we decided that the best and most practical thing would be to communicate with animal control police and make a formal complaint solely about the unbearable noise of the dogs at our window. Since unfortunately, we had no concrete evidence of the rest of her misdeeds, they kindly asked us to record the barking in detail. And after a considerable time of keeping a meticulous record, we came to the terrible conclusion that the dogs barked between 55 and 65 hours a week, an astronomical figure. You can imagine how absolutely desperate and maddening it was to live like that. After several weeks of exhaustive monitoring and sleepless nights, I simply couldn't continue with that anymore. I was at the limit of my resistance. When we finally took all the evidence of the barking to the police, they showed up at Martha's house and gave her a severe formal warning. This was something she, as expected, didn't take well at all, and as a direct consequence, things got even worse between us. A couple of weeks after that episode, she decided to retaliate and called 911. That's how, around 10:30 at night on March 13th, we heard a loud and authoritative knock on our door. When my husband opened it, we were completely stunned and speechless to see that outside there were no less than 2 police patrol cars and 4 uniformed officers. All this for a supposed and completely invented domestic fight that our sweet and considerate neighbor Martha had reported. Thank you so much, Martha, for the wonderful gesture on any given night. Every few months, she had the hateful habit of calling the police on us for totally absurd and unfounded things. And although we no longer spoke to each other at all, she was always incredibly aware of everything we did or didn't do. What we didn't know at that precise moment was that she strategically kept a wheelchair in her house, and that before the police arrived that night, she already had perfectly prepared and rehearsed a pitiful and moving story about being a poor, defenseless elderly woman who was being constantly harassed and mistreated by us, her evil neighbors. I'm only a few years younger than Martha, so ironically, when the police arrived at our house alerted by her calls, I was the one who ended up receiving all the criticism and lectures for supposedly being the problematic and conflictive neighbor. And to top it all off, thanks to my excellent hairdresser, my hair isn't gray at all, so I appear to be quite a bit younger than her, which inevitably made the officers think I was the one who should be more mature, understanding, and responsible in this whole situation. My husband and I were completely desperate and demoralized, since Martha's constant and systematic harassment had reached a point where it was truly seriously affecting our mental state and quality of life. Just so you have a better and clearer idea of the magnitude of her evil, one day I was given a pair of beautiful canaries, which I kept in a small and cute cage located at the edge of my kitchen window. But one morning when I woke up, I found with horror the cage wide open, and a bunch of feathers from my poor canaries cruelly scattered just on the other side of the window, outside. However, at that point, I no longer knew for certain if it had been her dogs, or if it had been herself, who had done such a heartless and merciless evil. But what was even worse and more chilling is that I was completely sure that the night before I had closed my kitchen window very well, as I always did, so inevitably someone had to open it from inside or outside to be able to get the canaries out of the cage. After all these continuous and disturbing episodes of systematic harassment, we finally decided to install hidden security cameras at several strategic points on our property. We knew perfectly well that Martha clearly enjoyed the attention that police officers lavished on her every time they responded to her call. Once, in fact, a policeman came to our house visibly annoyed after hearing her detailed and victimizing story. Then, with a severe tone, he asked us to stop once, and for all harassing everyone in the neighborhood. But instead of arguing, we decided to calmly show him the recordings from our cameras. And right there, he was completely speechless and dumbfounded. In the images, there wasn't the slightest trace of the supposed wheelchair she claimed to use. And each and every one of the things Martha claimed I had done to her had actually been done by herself against us. Just one day after installing the cameras, there was even a terrifying moment when she tried to deliberately run me over with her car when I was out walking peacefully down the street. And it wasn't just her participating in these aggressions. A friend of hers, equally unhinged, had tried to do exactly the same thing on another occasion, and both were clearly captured on video perpetrating these actions. I didn't even have to bother calling 911 in that particular case because, as was her custom, Martha was the one who did it first, filling the emergency call with a bunch of lies and false accusations against me. The officer who came to the scene could barely believe what he was seeing in the recordings we showed him. But beyond all this, there were days when she would park her car right in front of our house and sit there for hours simply watching us fixedly, taking photographs and videos of the interior of our home, invading our privacy in the most shameless way. She only did that one more time after we confronted her, because after learning that we had recorded her in the act and receiving another strong warning from the police, she finally realized that the recordings were much more evident and compromising than she thought. So after that specific incident, her hostile performance calmed down a bit, and things were relatively quiet for about 10 months, a respite we greatly appreciated. But one night when we least expected it, everything changed drastically. We heard a great and sudden crash, and the whole house shook violently. We quickly looked through our bedroom window and saw a couple of unknown cars parked in front of Martha's house. And we noticed that something very strange was happening in our own yard. But instead of rushing out to investigate, we decided to first check our security cameras, as was already our custom. And when we did, we saw with horror how Martha's son, a young man who also seemed to have problems, threw something forcefully toward our house, right in the direction of our bedroom window, which by strange coincidence was open that night. Luckily, this object didn't manage to get in, but bounced violently off the exterior wall and fell into the garden, causing a small explosion that singed a considerable part of our beautiful rose bush. That was the explosion that made the entire structure of the house vibrate. Immediately, without thinking twice, we called the police. But since fortunately there were no serious injuries or significant property damage, just a few singed plants in the garden and a good scare, they didn't even bother to take an official report of the incident. Yes, I know, it's completely outrageous and frustrating. But at that point, my husband and I were already too stressed, exhausted, and fed up with this whole situation. And seeing that things were only escalating dangerously in violence, we finally decided to call a real estate agent. In less than 2 weeks, incredibly fast, we had already moved from there. It was without a doubt the best thing we could have done for our mental health and safety. And thank God we never saw that psychopath Martha or her problematic family again. It was the fall of 2003, and having just turned 17, my family made the momentous decision to move to a small and picturesque town nestled in the mountains of West Virginia. Shortly after we settled in, I became very good friends with another boy my age who lived relatively close to our new house, and his name was Leo. One night just before winter began and the cold became more intense, Leo and I were exploring with youthful curiosity the dense forest that surrounded the town when we found a river, not very large or rushing, that ran serpentine through part of the adjacent property. Since we were simply two fairly bored teenage boys in a tiny town where there really wasn't too much to do for entertainment, nothing better or more exciting occurred to us at that moment than jumping into the icy water and starting to swim upstream, laughing heartily and joking nonstop, fully enjoying our small and improvised aquatic adventure. We were like that, splashing and exploring, until the sun finally disappeared completely behind the imposing mountains, tinting the sky with orange and purple tones. But instead of getting out of the water, drying off, and changing plans, or simply returning each to our respective homes, we decided in a burst of youthful audacity to keep soaking in the increasingly cold and dark water. After a good while floating and chatting, Leo suddenly fell into absolute silence and made a clear signal with his hand for me to swim a little closer to him, to where he was. When I was finally at his side, he whispered to me with a notably broken voice full of apprehension, "Look discreetly behind me toward the tree line. I firmly believe there's someone watching us from there." Normally, in any other circumstances, I would have immediately dismissed what he said as pure imagination or a product of nervousness. But the palpable and genuine anguish in his voice made me seriously doubt for an instant. So I looked very carefully toward where he indicated with his head, and tried to peer with all my might into the growing darkness that hung between the forest trees. But several tense seconds passed, and I saw absolutely nothing move, not a single suspicious shadow. Therefore, I responded in a low voice that it was probably just some nocturnal animal from around there, or perhaps a bit of shadow cast by the denser bushes. Here in this specific stretch of the forest, there was usually absolutely no one ever, and I very much doubted that any other person besides us knew this remote and hidden part of the river. Leo, however, didn't seem to be reassured in the slightest. He was much more concentrated and uneasy, staring fixedly at the dark line of trees, and for an instant everything was submerged in an incredibly tense and uncomfortable silence, charged with a strange premonition. "Did you hear that?" he suddenly asked me, startling me. I assured him I hadn't heard anything at all, but Leo insisted vehemently that I come even closer. So I slowly swam toward the shore with him, feeling a mixture of curiosity and slight fear to see what was really happening. I also mentioned in passing that if we got completely out of the water at that moment, with the cold that was starting to set in, we might not want to get back in afterward. But he didn't respond to my comment. Instead, he quickly got out of the water with agility. I, however, immersed in my own world and not giving too much importance to the matter, continued swimming completely carefree for a few more minutes, without thinking even for a second that being alone in a river, just meters from the forest, and in complete darkness, could be potentially dangerous. At best, I could hit myself against some rock or simply get lost in the blackness. But also, and this was more worrying, there could be dangerous animals lurking in the water or on the shore. I don't know exactly how much time passed since Leo got out of the water, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but suddenly I felt strangely and inexplicably alone in the immensity of the river. I swam instinctively toward the shore, and to my surprise and growing uneasiness, I didn't see Leo anywhere. Our 2 flashlights were there on a rock, almost forgotten and turned off to one side, next to our shoes and dry clothes. I called Leo loudly while getting out clumsily from the icy water, but I got no response, only the echo of my own voice bouncing off the trees. With one of the flashlights already in my trembling hand, I illuminated the trees around me, sweeping the darkness with the beam of light. But his name remained floating pitifully in the air, without response once more, which increased my nervousness. I thought maybe he was playing a prank on me, so I moved very carefully and stealthily toward the area where he had been looking so insistently before. I was about to shout his name again, more forcefully this time, when I finally saw him. He was with his back to me, completely motionless, standing several meters away, absorbed and concentrated on what lay deeper in the dark and silent forest. At that moment, I approached cautiously, but he didn't turn around or make any sign of having heard me. When I got right to his side, I shouted, already a bit annoyed and scared, "Leo, damn it, why don't you answer me?" And just when I extended my hand to touch his shoulder and get his attention, he suddenly raised a bony hand and pointed with a trembling finger toward the deep darkness that stretched before us. "Do you see that thing that's there? What the hell is it? Can you illuminate it with your flashlight, please?" he said to me with a barely audible voice charged with terror. At that precise instant, his face looked incredibly pale under the deathly light of the moon, as if he had fainted or was about to do so. His eyes were wide open, bulging with fear. And for a fleeting instant, I noticed an extremely disturbing detail that I knew I could never forget. A small drop of fresh blood was slowly running down his nose, staining his upper lip. The tension filled the air almost palpably. I was completely paralyzed by panic, not knowing whether I should insistently ask him what he was seeing, or if I should simply flee from there at full speed without looking back. What the hell was happening in that place? When I finally turned the flashlight with trembling hands toward where Leo was pointing with such dread, I asked him in a whisper who or what that was. At that instant, time seemed to freeze completely. The beam of light from my flashlight first caught a pair of long, thin legs clad in dark, worn pants. And suddenly, my heart gave a violent leap in my chest. The flashlight in my hand felt as if it were filled with molten lead. And I can assure you that in any other less terrifying circumstances, I would have instinctively raised the beam of light toward the sky without thinking twice to illuminate the complete figure. But in this critical moment, it was incredibly difficult for me to raise my arm, as if I were fighting against an invisible and powerful force that prevented me from doing so. The legs kept moving slowly toward us, and little by little, a dark and hunched torso appeared in view. When the light finally passed over his bony chin, I found myself face to face with an enormous, grotesque, and spine-chilling smile. Without a doubt, the most terrifying and unnatural one I had ever seen in my entire life. It was a true and absolute shock to my senses. Without thinking about it for even a second longer, I turned around abruptly and dropped the flashlight to the ground with a crash. I collided violently with Leo when I turned so quickly, and we both ended up falling clumsily to the muddy ground. "Run, Leo, run for your life," I screamed with all my might, and I didn't hesitate for an instant to shoot out of there like an absolute madman, running desperately downstream, fumbling for the path we had initially taken to get there. I don't know exactly how many times I tripped and fell during that frantic race. I'd say at least 6 or 7 times, maybe even 10 or more. Each time I fell to the ground, I got up with an almost instinctive jump, barely conscious of what I was doing, guided only by the faint and spectral light of the stars that barely filtered through the dense branches of the trees. Very far in the distance, I could see the familiar and comforting glow of the lights from my house. But that safe and longed-for point seemed to get farther and farther away as I ran. In that moment of absolute panic, I didn't worry at all about Leo, because I was completely sure he was running right behind me, stumbling and making as much noise as I was in his desperate flight. I entered like a whirlwind through the garage door and went directly into the kitchen of my house, screaming as if I were possessed by some malevolent entity. "Damn it, please help me," I screamed with a broken voice. My arms and face were completely covered with deep scratches and scrapes, and at some point during the race, I had lost one of my sneakers. But at that moment, I couldn't think about any of that. I just screamed desperately at my parents to immediately call the police. I quickly looked over my shoulder, expecting to see Leo come running in behind me, but to my growing terror, he wasn't there. At first, I naively assumed he had run directly to his house, which was a short distance away. I earnestly begged my parents to urgently contact Leo's parents after the police arrived at the scene. While waiting for the police dragged on endlessly, I couldn't stop trembling like a leaf. When the first officers finally arrived, They looked at me with that very particular mixture of genuine concern and evident bewilderment, as if they thought maybe I had taken some drug or something like that. But it was then that we received the dreaded call from Leo's parents. They were calling desperately to try to find out if he had returned home with me that night. The police quickly decided they needed to organize an exhaustive search team immediately. So they brought specially trained tracking dogs and many more officers to comb the area. At that moment, I felt absolutely terrified. I didn't even want to start thinking about the horrible possibility that my best friend had been caught by that strange and sinister being we had seen in the forest. The police and volunteers undertook the search without delay, and soon they found our things abandoned near the riverbank. But there were no signs of Leo or of the strange and spine-chilling man we had seen among the trees. Days passed slowly, turning into weeks, and the authorities couldn't gather a single useful clue about Leo's possible whereabouts. The official search continued for several agonizing months, and more than 120,000 acres of dense forest were meticulously reviewed, but without any success. Leo simply disappeared without leaving any trace whatsoever. To this day, 22 long and painful years later, Leo has not been seen again, nor has anything been heard from him. The local media covered the story at the time, of course, but living in such a small and isolated town, where unfortunately people disappear into the immensity of the forest with some frequency, I don't really know how far the news of his disappearance reached. The most painful and heartbreaking thing about all this is that Leo's family still has no concrete answers 22 years later, living in constant uncertainty every day. Since that fateful night, I'm overwhelmed by unbearable and crushing guilt. I often ask myself over and over again if I'll ever be able to forgive myself for not stopping even for a single instant to make sure he was running right behind me, safe. I still remember with terrifying clarity the sound of his footsteps, or what I believed were his footsteps, echoing loudly behind me as I ran like a man possessed. But I never knew, and probably never will know, at what precise moment he stopped following me, or what really happened to him. As a terrible and persistent thought that torments me day and night, I wonder if it wasn't really my friend who was running behind me in that final instant, but the stranger himself pursuing me. What if what happened to Leo was something much more terrifying and sinister than anything we could ever imagine in our worst nightmares? That single and chilling thought produces terrible, uncontrollable shivers in me and gives me horrible nightmares at night. For 22 long years now, I've carried this burden, wondering if there was something more I could have done, some way I could have saved him. The image of that grotesque smile haunts me still, and sometimes in my darkest moments, I wonder if that thing is still out there in those woods, waiting for its next victim. A few years ago, I left behind a chaotic shared house in the suburbs of Portland and decided to venture out on my own. I found a tiny one-bedroom apartment right in the heart of downtown. I was 28 at the time, and while the place was undeniably small and showed obvious signs of wear and tear, I was absolutely fascinated by it because it was located just 6 blocks from one of the most popular and vibrant nightclubs in the city center. For my lifestyle back then, this was simply perfect. Being single and thoroughly enjoying nights out with my circle of friends at bars and clubs quite frequently, the location made complete sense. This way, I could walk home peacefully instead of spending considerable amounts on rideshares every weekend. Plus, the apartment was conveniently close to my workplace, so all the pieces fit together perfectly and harmoniously. On my first day, I settled in with surprising speed, and without wasting any time, I called my closest friends over for a few cold beers before diving into the excitement of the night. However, as expected in my tiny apartment, there wasn't room for everyone I had invited, so some squeezed inside as best they could, creating a festive and somewhat cramped atmosphere, while others stayed drinking cheerfully in the building's hallway. While we were there with music blasting and drinks flowing freely, I began to hear with growing clarity the couple from the adjacent apartment arguing heatedly. Since the building was quite old, the walls were incredibly thin, almost like paper. Driven by curiosity, I quietly approached the wall to try to better understand the nature of the altercation. I had just arrived, so I hadn't had the slightest opportunity to meet my new neighbors. So naturally, I was very curious about what was happening right next door. From everything I managed to hear between the shouting and pauses, I could deduce that it was a gay couple, both around 35 years old. One of them was yelling vehemently at the other to go out and ask us, his new and noisy neighbor, to calm down a bit and turn down the music volume. The other replied in a more conciliatory tone that it was just a housewarming party, and that in his opinion, it wasn't necessary to make such a big drama about it. Clearly, the second man, the calmer one, was already starting to appeal to me much more than his boyfriend, who seemed quite irritable. To avoid unnecessary problems and not start off on the wrong foot in my new life in the building, I decided to take my friends outside, and we all headed together toward the club, thus leaving the neighbors in the tranquility of their home. Later that night, when I returned home completely alone, I was absolutely exhausted from the move and celebration. I preferred that my friends continue partying on their own without me. When I reached my apartment door, I was fumbling for my keys when I noticed a guy in the hallway right in front of the apartment next door, smoking a cigarette with a thoughtful air. The man was notably tall and thin, with dark, disheveled hair. I also saw a recent cut on his lip and a bruise that was beginning to form around one of his eyes. "Hello," I said kindly. "Sorry about all the noise earlier. I guess you're my neighbor." "Yeah, don't worry about it at all, man," he replied with a half-smile. "I'm Victor," he responded, shaking my hand firmly. At that precise moment, I realized his knuckles were visibly bruised and swollen, so I inevitably thought something quite strange and probably violent was happening there. I apologized profusely for the earlier noise and told him I sincerely hoped I hadn't caused too many problems between them. But he, with a surprisingly soft voice that nevertheless showed a slight tremor, said everything was fine, that only Ricardo, his boyfriend, I assumed from the context of the argument I had heard earlier, sometimes got in very bad moods, but that he, Victor, was more or less used to those outbursts. At the end of our brief but revealing chat, I told him we'd see each other again more calmly later. It was already about 3 in the morning, and I just wanted to get into bed and sleep deeply. But I couldn't stop turning over in my head the possible and very probable fight that was occurring in the apartment next door. And it anguished me to think that maybe somehow it had all been my fault. I decided to keep a watchful eye on the situation for now, because I really wasn't very clear about what exactly was happening. A fight with his boyfriend was the first and most obvious thing I thought of. But there was also the possibility that Victor had simply gotten into some kind of trouble with someone else outside his relationship. Over the weeks, I realized with growing concern that my neighbors hit the bottle almost every week without exception, and began fighting scandalously as soon as they had a bit too much to drink. Ricardo, who seemed to be the more corpulent and strong of the couple, always had the louder and more dominant voice, and Victor, for his part, seemed to be completely scared and intimidated by him. His unrestrained shouts full of anger could be heard with complete clarity from my apartment. So for prudence and to avoid complications, I chose to stay on the sidelines and not get involved in their personal affairs. With the incredibly thin walls, it really was a very uncomfortable situation to hear Ricardo thinking I was a problem for them. Or worse yet, that I had some kind of romantic or sexual interest in Victor. So for my own mental health, I decided to disconnect from all that constant drama by using my headphones and immersing myself in my favorite video games. My days were completely full of work Monday through Friday, and going out with friends on weekends. This routine was something that helped me enormously avoid having guests at home, since I honestly didn't want to hear the endless and increasingly violent discussions of my conflicted neighbors. Everything worked relatively well until New Year's Eve of that same year. That particular night, I returned from doing some last-minute shopping, completely ready to wrap gifts carefully, because I planned to visit my family the next day to celebrate. But when I arrived at the building, I saw 2 police patrol cars parked outside with their lights on, and Elena, a girl of Asian origin who lived on a floor above, screaming desperately and inconsolably. This, of course, alarmed me tremendously, and I immediately asked Elena what was happening. But she could only respond between sobs that it was something very sad, while continuing to cry uncontrollably. When I cautiously approached the scene, I noticed that 3 police officers were trying to control someone with considerable difficulty. One of the officers' uniforms was visibly stained with blood, and right in the middle of all the tumult and confusion, I saw Victor completely bloodied and with a horrible wound on his jaw, as if he had been cut with some sharp and large object. They were lifting him from the ground with effort, and when I looked more carefully and with horror, I realized there was an incredibly deep wound on his cheek that opened grotesquely as he struggled violently with the officers, apologizing between choked sobs and screams of pain. While trying to assimilate all that hellish scene, I turned to Elena again to try to console her, because she was immersed in uncontrollable crying. It was at that precise instant when suddenly Ricardo's unmistakable voice resonated with fury, shouting absolutely terrible things at Victor like, "Kill yourself once and for all, you damn loser." That made me feel a primal fear, so I decided on the spot that it would be best to get Elena and myself away from all that madness and imminent danger. However, she insisted vehemently that she would stay there, saying over and over that she was fine. But I simply couldn't stay there contemplating that human disaster. I began looking for Ricardo with my eyes, analyzing the situation, turning over the terrible idea that he could explode with rage at any moment, while the 2 policemen struggled with all their might to control a completely out-of-control Victor, who was begging with heartbreaking screams for them to let him go at once. However, I couldn't see Ricardo anywhere, so I decided that the most sensible and safe thing for me was to return to my apartment and lock the door. But just as I turned on my heels to leave, I felt an icy chill run down my spine when I heard Ricardo behind me ask with a sinister voice, "Where the hell do you think you're going?" I immediately turned to look at him, and my mind simply couldn't process what I was seeing before my eyes. Those threatening words were coming from Victor, but that was undoubtedly Ricardo's powerful and aggressive voice. It was then that the crude and spine-chilling truth hit me head-on with the force of a freight train. And I can't even begin to describe the overwhelming and visceral panic I felt when I realized with terrifying clarity that Victor and Ricardo were actually the same and only person. To say that all those fights and deafening screams, all that violence and unleashed madness came from a single disturbed and lonely guy in his small and dark apartment. That revelation left me in a state of deep shock, almost paralyzed, while my mind struggled to process the bizarre reality of the situation. Never in my entire life had I witnessed or imagined something remotely similar to that. Later that same day, Elena, still affected, told me this wasn't the first time Victor had had a crisis of this type, and that the police had already come to his house on multiple previous occasions. She explained in detail that Victor had spent considerable time admitted to a psychiatric hospital just a few months ago, but that he had actually been going in and out of those types of places intermittently for several years now. She also told me, to my slight relief, that fortunately Victor had only hurt himself so far and had never physically attacked another person. Apparently, whenever Ricardo wanted to get aggressive with someone else, Victor would somehow appear to stop him, and then turn all his fury and aggression toward himself, toward his own body. When I learned all these details about his complex and tragic situation, I couldn't help but feel deep and sincere pity for Victor. It seemed truly horrible and desolate to me to think about the idea of being a constant victim of yourself and the torments of your own mind. I moved from that building shortly after that incident, and from what I learned, Victor never returned to his apartment, so I assumed he was still admitted to the hospital. But I honestly wished with all my heart that someday he could find a way to overcome his serious disorder and find some peace. I understand this story might seem hard to believe, and I'm keeping my identity anonymous for reasons that will become clear. What I'm about to describe is less of a single incident and more of an ongoing anomaly that's been happening in my neighborhood for as long as I can remember. Something centered around one particular neighbor and the massive tree in her backyard. This takes place in Salem, Oregon, in a quiet residential area where I've lived since I was 12 years old. The neighbor I'm talking about moved in around the same time my family did, back in 1998, and from day one, people whispered about her. I'll call her Mrs. Blackwood, though that's not her real name. Mrs. Blackwood was probably in her 60s when she moved in, a thin, sharp-featured woman who kept entirely to herself. She never spoke to anyone in the neighborhood, never participated in block parties or community events, and seemed to deliberately avoid contact with other people. But it wasn't just her antisocial behavior that made her notorious. It was the sounds, smells, and activities that came from her property. You could hear strange noises coming from her house at all hours, especially late at night. Sometimes it sounded like multiple people chanting or singing in a language none of us recognized. Other times there were these rhythmic tapping or scraping sounds, like someone was digging or carving something repeatedly. And the smells, they were unlike anything I'd encountered before. Sharp medicinal odors mixed with something sweet and rotting. Scents that would drift across the entire block on certain nights. What made it even more unsettling was the steady stream of visitors she received. Different people would arrive at her house at all hours, stay for a few hours, and leave under cover of darkness. When they left, that's when the strangest smells would start permeating the neighborhood. We'd also see her leaving her house in the early morning hours, always carrying large black duffel bags or suitcases, loading them into her old sedan, and driving off to unknown destinations. But the most disturbing thing was watching her bring home live animals. We'd see her carrying small cages containing chickens, rabbits, cats, or small dogs. The animals would go into her house, but they never came back out. Not alive, anyway. All of this would have been concerning enough on its own, but there was something else that made Mrs. Blackwood's property truly extraordinary. The tree in her backyard. This wasn't just any tree. It was absolutely enormous, easily twice the height of any house in the neighborhood. You could see it from blocks away. This massive oak that seemed to dwarf everything around it. None of the longtime residents could remember when that tree had been planted. When families moved into the neighborhood, the tree was already there, fully grown and dominating the landscape. What made it even more remarkable was its apparent indestructibility. Over the years, we'd experienced severe storms, ice storms that brought down power lines and damaged roofs, and even a wildfire that swept through the area behind Mrs. Blackwood's property in 2006. Through it all, that tree remained completely untouched, as if it existed in its own protected bubble. If the tree's size and resilience were the only unusual things about it, I probably would have dismissed it as just a quirk of nature. But the tree was connected to much stranger phenomena that happened only at night. Several neighbors who lived adjacent to Mrs. Blackwood's property reported hearing voices coming from the tree after dark. Not just one or two voices, but what sounded like dozens of people talking simultaneously. Their voices drifting down from the upper branches like they were having conversations high above the ground. This was clearly impossible. The tree was far too tall and unstable for anyone to climb, and the sheer number of voices suggested a crowd of people somehow suspended in the air. The voices only appeared when Mrs. Blackwood spent time in her backyard near the tree, which she did regularly. Neighbors reported seeing her standing at the base of the tree, apparently talking to it, like she was having a conversation with the massive trunk. The disembodied voices from the branches seemed to respond to her, creating this bizarre dialogue between the woman and whatever was speaking from above. These conversations would continue throughout the night until sunrise, when everything would go silent again. The neighbors who lived close enough to hear it said they could never make out the actual words being spoken, but the tone suggested intense, urgent discussions about unknown topics. My brother Marcus witnessed something even more bizarre one night when he was coming home late from his girlfriend's place. As he was parking his car in our driveway, he saw what he initially thought was some kind of electrical explosion or lightning strike. a brilliant flash of light appeared out of nowhere, bright enough to illuminate the entire street for several seconds. When he didn't hear any thunder or see any signs of storm activity, he figured it must have been his imagination. But then it happened again, and this time he was paying closer attention. The light was coming from Mrs. Blackwood's tree, specifically from the trunk, which was pulsing with this intense, white-hot glow. Marcus said it looked like the tree had some kind of energy source inside it, like there was something alive within the wood that was generating light. The trunk would pulse every few seconds in a steady rhythm, bright enough to cast shadows across the neighboring yards. He was so unnerved by the sight that he didn't stick around to observe it further. He just grabbed his keys and ran inside. The most disturbing discovery came later, when multiple neighbors began reporting what they saw Mrs. Blackwood doing in her backyard during the late evening hours. She would carry what appeared to be raw meat, chunks of flesh that looked like they'd been freshly butchered, out to the tree in metal pans or trays. At the base of the enormous trunk, she would dig small holes in the dirt and bury the meat directly in the root system. On the opposite side of her yard, she kept a collection of empty animal cages, the same cages we'd seen her bring home filled with live animals. The conclusion was obvious and horrifying. Mrs. Blackwood was feeding the tree with the animals she'd been collecting. She was literally burying fresh meat in the roots, like she was providing sustenance to something that lived underground. This went on for years, with more and more neighbors witnessing these feeding rituals. The pattern was always the same: bring home live animals, keep them for a day or two, then carry chunks of raw meat to the tree and bury it in the root system. The tree seemed to thrive on this grotesque diet, growing even larger and more robust with each passing year. By 2019, several neighbors had had enough. Someone called the police to report suspicious activity, though I never found out exactly what they told the officers. When the police arrived to investigate, they found Mrs. Blackwood's house locked up tight with no one home. Her car was gone, and she never returned. That was over 5 years ago now. Mrs. Blackwood simply vanished, leaving behind her house, her empty animal cages, and that massive tree. A new family moved into the property about a year ago, but they seemed to be normal people with no connection to the previous owner. The strange thing is that since Mrs. Blackwood disappeared, all the paranormal activity stopped immediately. No more voices in the tree, no more pulsing lights, no more unexplained sounds or smells. It's like whatever presence was connected to her left when she did. But I still find myself staring at that tree sometimes, wondering what's buried in the soil around its roots, and what kind of relationship Mrs. Blackwood had with whatever lived inside that ancient oak. I think about the voices my neighbors heard speaking from the branches, and the energy source that made the trunk glow like it had a heart beating inside it. Most of all, I wonder what happened to Mrs. Blackwood herself. Did she leave voluntarily, or did whatever she was feeding finally demand something more than animal sacrifices? And what would happen if she ever came back to reclaim her connection to that tree? I'm planning to move away from this neighborhood within the next year, partly because of job opportunities, but also because I'll never be able to look at that tree without remembering what I know about its history. Some secrets are too dark to live with, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I can't help wondering if there are other trees like this one in other neighborhoods, and other people like Mrs. Blackwood feeding them in the darkness, maintaining relationships with forces that existed long before humans built houses around them. If you ever encounter something similar, my advice is simple. Don't investigate, don't try to understand it, and don't stick around to see what happens next. I know many people might find what I'm about to tell you incredible, maybe even impossible. The details of what happened to me are so strange that I'm fully aware some won't believe it. But I'm sharing this hoping someone might help me understand what could have occurred, because I honestly have no idea, though it was completely real. This happened back in 2003, when I was living in a small town called Cedar Falls in northern Iowa. I had just moved out of my parents' house and rented a modest little place near the community center. It was my first time living completely on my own, and I was determined to make it work. From the very first weeks, I got along wonderfully with several of my neighbors. We introduced ourselves, exchanged pleasantries on the street, and eventually shared phone numbers for practical purposes. You know, to check if the water was running, if someone needed help with groceries, that sort of thing that neighbors do for each other. There was one neighbor in particular, a woman I'd guess was around 55 years old. I never knew her exact age, but she seemed to be in that range. Her name was Margaret, and I knew she worked for the state insurance office because I'd see her coming home in the evenings wearing her official uniform. She lived in the house directly next to mine, so close I could hear when she slammed her front door. For 2 full years, everything was perfectly normal. Never once did we have any strange incidents with anyone in the neighborhood. Margaret was always friendly, waving when she saw me, sometimes stopping to chat about the weather or local happenings. She seemed like the most ordinary person you could imagine. But then came that night in mid-October, right around 3:50 in the morning. I remember the exact time because of what happened next. My phone rang, one of those old cordless phones with the little green display screen. When I looked at it, still half asleep, I saw it was Margaret's number calling. It struck me as odd that she'd call so late, especially on a Tuesday night. I stumbled out of bed and grabbed the phone from my nightstand, and the moment I answered, I could hear her crying. She was clearly desperate, but she was whispering, almost like she was trying not to be heard by someone else in her house. At first, I couldn't understand what she was saying. Her words were all jumbled together, broken up by these quiet sobs. I asked her to please calm down, told her I couldn't make out what she was trying to tell me, and asked if she wanted me to come over to help. That's when she raised her voice just slightly, enough for me to hear her clearly say, "No, don't come over here. I don't know who else to call. Those children, they came for me again. They got into my house somehow." I immediately told her I was calling the police and heading over, at minimum to scare off whoever had broken in. But before I could say anything else, I heard what sounded like a door slamming shut, not just through the phone, but actually through my own walls, since we lived so close together. Then I heard Margaret scream just briefly, before the line went dead. I called 911 immediately, gave them her address, explained that someone had broken into my neighbor's house, and told them I was going over to check on the situation. The dispatcher said they'd send a unit, and advised me to stay on the line. But I told them I had to hang up because I was already heading out the door. When I got to Margaret's house, Everything looked completely normal from the outside. I knocked on her front door, tried the handle, locked. Her car was parked in its usual spot in the driveway. I knew she had a back entrance through her patio, but I couldn't get to it because she had a tall wooden fence topped with those broken glass bottle pieces, specifically designed to keep people from climbing over. While I was standing there trying to figure out what to do, another neighbor showed up, Bill, who lived 2 houses down. He looked just as worried as I felt. He asked if Margaret was okay, said she'd called him just a few minutes earlier, saying that some children had broken into her house. I told him the same thing had happened to me, that I was trying to get inside to help her, but I couldn't hear anything from inside, and all the lights were off. I don't know if we got lucky, or if there happened to be a patrol car nearby that night, but the police arrived within about 10 minutes, pretty fast for a small Iowa town. We filled them in on what had happened, explaining that we were both called by the same neighbor reporting an intruder. The officers made the decision to force entry, considering the circumstances and the fact that 2 separate people had received identical distress calls. Margaret lived alone. All her windows had security bars, and the house was completely sealed up. If someone had broken in, it could definitely be a dangerous situation. When they broke down the front door, they called out for Margaret repeatedly, but got no response. My neighbor Bill and I stayed outside, but we could see into the house from where we stood. That's when we noticed the smell. I think most people would recognize it immediately. It's the unmistakable odor that comes when someone has passed away. Sure enough, after a few minutes of searching, the officers began calling for backup and the coroner. They'd found Margaret in her bedroom, deceased, lying in her bed with the telephone still clutched in her hand. When they told us this, Bill and I just stared at each other in complete disbelief. It made no sense whatsoever. Margaret had called both of us. That's why we were standing there at that exact moment. One of the officers, clearly as puzzled as we were, said he didn't know how to explain it. But there she was, phone in hand, like maybe that detail could somehow make sense of the impossible situation. We stayed for all the necessary police procedures, gave our statements, and watched as the coroner's team did their work. Eventually, Margaret's family came to town to handle her affairs, and that house sat empty for months afterward. I moved away about a year later, but I've never forgotten what happened that night. The questions that still haunt me are, what children was she referring to? How did she manage to call both of us if she was already gone? And what exactly did she die from? We never found out the cause of death, and the whole thing just remains this unsolved mystery that changed how I think about what's possible in this world. Sometimes I wonder if there are things beyond our understanding that can reach across the divide between life and death when something urgent needs to be communicated. Or maybe there's a simpler explanation that I just can't see. But whatever the truth is, I'll never forget the sound of Margaret's voice that night, or the impossible phone call that brought 2 neighbors to her door exactly when she needed to be found. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me 7 years ago, but I need you to understand why I can't give you all the details, why I can't tell you exactly where this took place or use anyone's real names. When you hear the whole story, you'll understand why some things are better left buried in official reports that never see the light of day. This happened when I was working as a medic at a military installation in New Mexico. I was 28 years old and had just been assigned to a new base near Roswell. The housing on base was limited, so I found a small rental house in a quiet neighborhood just 10 minutes from work. It was a strange little place. 3 houses built around a shared courtyard, each one larger than you'd expect for such a small complex. My landlord, a nervous man named Garcia, offered me a great deal on the rent, which should have been my first red flag. But I was young and the money was good, and it was walking distance to some of the best Mexican food I'd ever tasted. My neighbors seemed harmless enough. There was Mrs. White, I'll call her that to protect her identity, an elderly woman who lived in the house directly next to mine. She appeared to be in her 70s, a small, frail-looking woman with silver hair who always wore simple dresses and cardigans. She had a way of making you feel instantly welcome, with a warm smile and kind eyes that seemed to light up whenever she saw me heading off to work in the morning. The third neighbor was a man named David, probably in his 30s, who worked nights somewhere and kept to himself. Nice enough guy when our paths crossed, but we were basically ships passing in the night. For the first few months, everything was perfect. Mrs. White and I had developed a pleasant routine. She'd wave to me from her little garden every morning as I left for the base, and we'd exchange pleasantries about the weather or the beautiful sunrise over the desert. She reminded me of my grandmother back in Ohio, and I found myself looking forward to these brief interactions. That's when the knocking started. It began in late fall, around 1 or 2 in the morning. Someone would pound on the wall that separated my house from Mrs. White's, not gentle tapping, but hard, desperate knocking that would jolt me awake. It sounded like someone using their fists, hitting the wall with enough force that I could feel the vibrations through my mattress. The first few times it happened, I assumed Mrs. White was having some kind of emergency. Maybe she'd fallen and was trying to get my attention, or perhaps she was having a medical crisis. But the knocking would only last for 2 or 3 minutes before stopping completely, and by morning she'd be out in her garden, looking perfectly fine. After about a week of this, I decided to ask her about it. I approached her gently one morning, not wanting to embarrass her or make her feel bad about waking me up. "Good morning, Mrs. White," I said, walking over to where she was watering her roses. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you been having any problems at night? I've been hearing some noise from your side of the wall, and I wanted to make sure you're okay." The color drained from her face. She actually stumbled backward a step, dropping her watering can. "Noise?" she whispered. "What kind of noise?" "It sounds like someone knocking on the wall between our houses, usually around 1 or 2 a.m. I was worried you might be in trouble or need help with something." Mrs. White looked toward her house, then back at me, and I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "Oh my," she said, her voice barely audible. "Oh my goodness, I sleep so soundly I never hear anything, but if there's knocking..." She trailed off, then suddenly brightened with forced cheer. "I'll pick up some sage at the market today, maybe some special candles. Sometimes old houses just need a little spiritual cleansing, you know." I didn't think much more about it at the time. I figured she was just embarrassed about whatever was causing the noise, maybe old pipes or settling foundations. But 2 nights later, the knocking came back, louder than before. This went on for 2 weeks. Some nights there would be knocking, other nights there wouldn't be. But it was always the same pattern, desperate pounding on our shared wall in the middle of the night. And Mrs. White began avoiding me. She'd hurry inside when she saw me coming, or she'd wave quickly from her window instead of coming out to chat. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, I came home from work to find the entire block cordoned off with police tape. Were patrol cars, military vehicles, and most ominously, The coroner's van parked right in front of our little complex. I tried to approach the house, but the police wouldn't let me through. That's when I spotted Sergeant Martinez, someone I knew from the base medical facility. He was in uniform, clearly part of whatever operation was happening here. "Martinez," I called out. "What's going on? I live here." He walked over to me, looking grim. "Thompson, right? You're the medic from the base." "Yeah, what happened?" He looked around to make sure no one was listening, then pulled me aside. "Look, what I'm about to tell you is going to stay between us, understood? This is way above both our pay grades." I nodded. "We've been watching your neighbor, Mrs. White, for months. We had intelligence that suggested she was involved in some kind of trafficking operation, but we thought it was drugs or weapons. We finally got authorization to search her property this morning." He paused, looking sick. "Thompson, we found 7 people in her basement. They'd been held captive for God knows how long. When we found them this morning, they had just died, probably within the last 24 hours. And the condition they were in," he shook his head. "This woman wasn't just holding them prisoner, she was torturing them. All of them were missing their feet, among other things. The ME thinks she cut them off while they were still alive." The world seemed to tilt around me. Sweet Mrs. White, who smiled at me every morning and worried about spiritual cleansing. "The knocking," I whispered. "What?" "I've been hearing knocking on our shared wall for weeks. In the middle of the night, I thought it was her, but..." Martinez's face went pale. "Jesus Christ, you were hearing them. They were trying to get help, trying to get someone's attention." The investigation revealed that Mrs. White wasn't from New Mexico at all. She was from Louisiana, and she'd been moving around the Southwest for years, always staying just long enough to avoid suspicion. The people she'd taken were mostly drifters, runaways, people who wouldn't be missed right away. She died in custody 2 days after her arrest. The official cause of death was listed as complications from ingesting foreign objects. They found her stomach full of hair, insects, and what appeared to be some kind of homemade poison. The coroner said it looked like she'd been preparing for this day for a long time. But here's the part that still keeps me awake at night. A week after Mrs. White died, the knocking started again. I was lying in bed around 2 a.m. when I heard it, the same desperate pounding on the wall between our houses. But Mrs. White's house was empty, sealed off as part of the ongoing investigation. There was no one there. I called Martinez the next morning and told him what I'd heard. He said he'd check it out, and later that day, he called me back. "Thompson, I need you to find another place to live. Tonight." "What did you find?" My partner and I went into the house with a couple of local cops. We all saw her, Mrs. White, in that basement room where she kept those people. She was banging her head against the wall over and over, making the same sound you've been hearing. He was quiet for a moment. The door to that room slammed shut while we were watching her. When we got it open again, she was gone. There was no other way out of that room, Thompson, but we all saw her. We all heard what you've been hearing. I packed my things that night and stayed in the barracks on base until I could find another place. I never went back to that house, never drove past that neighborhood again. And I never told anyone else about what happened there, not until now. Sometimes I wonder about those 7 people, whether they found peace after their deaths, or if they're still trapped in that basement, still knocking on walls that no one will ever hear. I wonder if Mrs. White is still there too, replaying her crimes in some kind of eternal punishment. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some neighbors are not what they seem. For a couple of years during college, I worked weekends at the Detroit Eastern Market, one of those sprawling open-air markets where vendors sell everything from fresh produce to vintage furniture. The pay wasn't much, but it helped me cover tuition at Wayne State, and I actually enjoyed the hustle and bustle of market days. What I want to tell you about didn't happen at the market itself, but at a cluster of old warehouses about 3 blocks away. The market supervisor, a guy named Eddie, had worked out some kind of deal to rent space in these abandoned buildings, former residential units that had been converted into storage for some of the bigger vendors. This was back in the late 1990s, and Detroit was full of these kinds of forgotten places, whole blocks of buildings that had been beautiful once, now sitting empty and slowly falling apart. Eddie had gotten these warehouse spaces cheap, and he'd passed the savings on to vendors who needed somewhere to store their larger items between market days. I'd been making deliveries to these warehouses for about a month when it happened. I was working with Tommy, another college kid, and we were wheeling a hand truck full of antique furniture toward one of the storage units. When I grabbed the door handle to let us in, I immediately jerked my hand back and yelped in pain. The metal handle was scorching hot, so hot it felt like grabbing a frying pan straight off a stove. Tommy dropped the hand truck and asked to see my palm, which was already starting to blister. "Damn, man, you let go just in time," he said, then looked at me with this expression I'll never forget. "Wait, nobody told you about this place." I was shaking my hand out, trying to cool the burn with some water from a bottle we'd brought. "Told me what?" I asked. "That the door gets hot in the sun. It's not even sunny today." Tommy shook his head and pointed up at the building. "Look around, dude. We're completely in the shade. That door hasn't seen direct sunlight in hours." He pulled a rag out of his back pocket, one of those heavy work rags covered in grease and paint stains. "Eddie should have given you one of these on your first day coming here." He wrapped the rag around the handle and carefully opened the door, then told me what had happened in this building years before. The entire block had been residential, once families living in converted apartments. But this particular unit had caught fire back in the 80s. Luckily, most people had already started moving out because the landlord was jacking up the rent. So they'd gotten their belongings to safety before the flames really took hold. "Nobody died," Tommy explained as we moved our furniture inside, "but everything in here got completely torched. You can see they repainted all the walls, but if you look close, you can still see the scorch marks underneath." He pointed to the corners of the room, where the fresh white paint couldn't quite hide the black stains creeping through. "The weird thing is, Eddie says the door handle still gets burning hot sometimes, even in the middle of winter. That's why he keeps these rags in all the storage units, so people don't get burned like you just did." I thought this was the strangest thing I'd ever heard. How could a door handle randomly heat up years after a fire? But over the next few months, working at those warehouses, I learned to always check with the back of my hand before grabbing any of the door handles. And sure enough, maybe once every couple of weeks, I'd find one that was too hot to touch. I asked Eddie about it once, and he just shrugged. "Been like that since I started renting these places," he said. "I don't know why it happens, but it definitely happens. That's why I keep plenty of rags around." It wasn't like a traditional ghost story. No apparitions, no voices, no cold spots or moving objects. But there was something about that place that held onto the memory of what had happened there. The fire was long gone, the danger was over. But somehow the building itself still remembered the heat, still carried that burning moment in its walls and doors. I've always wondered if trauma can soak into a place like that. If the fear and chaos of that night somehow got absorbed into the brick and metal, replaying itself in random moments for anyone unlucky enough to grab a door handle at the wrong time. Even now, 20-some years later, I always pause before grabbing door handles in old buildings. Some memories, I learned, don't fade with time. They just wait patiently for the next person to come along and experience them all over again. My name is David, and I need to tell someone about what happened when my two brothers and I were kids, visiting our grandparents in their apartment complex in Queens, New York. This was back in the early 1990s, when I was 12, my brother Marcus was 10, and our youngest brother Tommy was 8. Our grandparents lived at Riverside Gardens, one of those sprawling brick complexes built in the 50s that housed working-class families. The buildings formed a large rectangle around a central courtyard, and in the back section, near the laundry room and garbage collection area, there was a small playground for the residents' children. The playground wasn't much to look at: a couple of swings hanging from rusty chains, a metal slide that got burning hot in the summer sun, a seesaw, and a set of monkey bars. Everything was surrounded by old oak trees that made that corner of the courtyard shadowy even during the day. On this particular evening in late September, we'd been inside watching TV with Grandma and Grandpa, but the apartment felt stuffy and we were getting restless. Our parents were visiting with the adults, talking about boring grown-up stuff. So around 8:30 we asked if we could go play outside for a while. "Stay where we can see you," Dad called as we headed for the door. "And stay together." The courtyard was mostly empty, a few adults sitting on benches near the main entrance, some teenagers hanging out by the mailboxes. We made our way to the playground, where we had the whole area to ourselves. Marcus and I claimed the swings while Tommy ran over to the seesaw, calling for one of us to join him. "Come on, somebody get on the other side," he shouted, already climbing onto one end. In a minute, I called back. I was enjoying the swing, and Marcus was trying to see who could swing higher. That's when I noticed her, a little girl walking out from behind the cluster of oak trees. She was maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing what looked like a simple white dress or nightgown. In the dim lighting, I could see her silhouette clearly, but her face was just a shadow. Without saying a word, she walked over to the seesaw and sat down on the end opposite Tommy. I remember thinking it was strange that I'd never seen her around the complex before, but I was just glad Tommy had found someone to play with. "Thanks," Tommy called to her, and began pushing off with his feet to start the seesaw motion. But something was wrong immediately. Instead of the gentle up and down rhythm you'd expect, Tommy shot up into the air with tremendous force, like he'd been launched by a catapult. He yelped in surprise and gripped the handles tightly to keep from being thrown off. "Easy," Marcus called out to the girl. "You're going to hurt him." The girl didn't respond. In fact, in all the time she was there, she never made a single sound. She just sat perfectly still while Tommy came back down, then sent him flying upward again with even more force. Tommy was laughing at first, thinking it was some kind of game, but I could hear the nervousness creeping into his voice. "Not so hard," he called to her, but she kept launching him skyward with impossible strength. "Hey," I shouted, getting off my swing. "Stop doing that." That's when a car turned into the complex parking lot, and its headlights swept across the playground. For just a moment, the girl's face was illuminated clearly. Marcus and I both saw it at the same time, and we both started running toward the building without thinking. What we saw wasn't the face of a child at all. It was the face of an ancient woman, deeply wrinkled and stern, with eyes that seemed to glitter with malice in the brief flash of light. We were halfway to the building entrance when we heard Tommy scream and the loud crash of the seesaw slamming against the ground. We turned back to see him running after us, tears streaming down his face, while the seesaw rocked back and forth from the impact. The girl was gone. Our parents and grandparents came rushing out when they heard us pounding on the apartment door, all three of us talking at once, trying to explain what had happened. They examined Tommy for injuries. He had some scrapes on his palms from gripping the seesaw handles so tightly, but nothing serious. "What did this girl look like?" Grandpa asked, but we struggled to describe her. In the dim light, she'd been mostly shadow and silhouette, except for that brief, terrifying moment when the car's headlights revealed her true face. "She had the face of an old lady," Marcus managed to say. "Like really old, with lots of wrinkles." Our parents exchanged glances. "Boys, you were probably just scared and imagining things," Mom said gently. "Sometimes shadows can play tricks on you." But Grandpa looked troubled. The next morning, he walked with us out to the playground and examined the seesaw carefully. "This thing's been here for 30 years, he said, testing its weight and balance. "Takes a lot of force to send someone flying like you described." He asked around among the other residents, but nobody had seen a little girl matching our description. The complex had very few children Tommy's age, and certainly none that any of the long-time residents didn't know. A week later, Grandpa called our house with news that chilled me to the bone. "You boys might want to sit down for this," he said when Dad put him on speakerphone. "I was talking to Mrs. Rodriguez, who's lived here since the complex opened. She remembered something from about 20 years ago, before you boys were born. There was a woman who lived here briefly, an elderly lady named Mrs. Kowalski. She was troubled. The other residents complained that she would wander around at night, muttering to herself, trying to get into other people's apartments." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. Mrs. Rodriguez said the woman was particularly fixated on the playground. She'd sit out there for hours, even in the middle of winter, talking to children who weren't there. The management company eventually had to evict her. "What happened to her?" Dad asked. "She died in a nursing home about 15 years ago. But here's the thing. Mrs. Rodriguez remembers that she was very small, maybe 4 feet 8 inches tall. And the other residents used to say she had this strange strength. Like she could move furniture around her apartment by herself, even though she looked so frail." After Grandpa hung up, our family sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Tommy spoke up in a small voice. "She was trying to hurt me, wasn't she? She wanted me to fall off and get hurt." None of us had an answer for that. But I've thought about it countless times over the years, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Whatever we encountered that night wasn't just the spirit of Mrs. Kowalski. It was something angry and malevolent, something that had taken her form, but twisted it into something designed to to harm children. We never went back to that playground. Even as adults, when we visit our grandparents, we give that corner of the courtyard a wide berth. Some places, I've learned, hold onto darkness long after the source of that darkness is gone. And sometimes, late at night, I still wake up remembering the sound of that seesaw crashing to the ground, and Tommy's terrified scream echoing across the empty courtyard. When my brother Jake and I were kids, he was 11 and I was about to turn 10. We lived with our parents in a small apartment complex in downtown Portland, Oregon. It was one of those old brick buildings from the 1920s, built around a central courtyard where all the tenants would hang their laundry and sometimes gather to chat. The thing was, we were the only kids in the entire complex. Our parents were the youngest adults there by at least 20 years, and most of our neighbors were elderly folks who'd been living there since before we were born. Jake and I would get so excited whenever we visited our cousins because it meant we finally had other kids to play with. Back home, it was just us two, playing alone in that empty courtyard while the grown-ups watched from their windows. That's why we were so thrilled when we started seeing other children playing near the back end of the complex, by the old storage building that had been empty for months. There were two of them about our age, and they always seemed to be there in the late afternoons when the sun was starting to set. They'd play quietly by themselves, never looking our way, never waving back when we tried to get their attention from across the courtyard. Every time Jake and I would start walking toward them, excited to finally make some friends, Mom would appear at our door and call us back inside. "Come on, boys, dinner's ready," she'd say, or "It's getting dark, time to come in." She always seemed to know exactly when we were heading their way, like she had some kind of radar for it. We'd beg her to let us go introduce ourselves, but she'd just shake her head and change the subject. "You boys need to listen when I call you," was all she'd say. We'd go inside, frustrated, and sometimes we could hear the sound of children laughing and playing outside our window late into the evening. The strange thing was, every time we saw these kids, they looked different. Sometimes the boy had dark hair, sometimes light. The girl might be wearing a blue dress one day and a red one the next. We figured maybe they were visiting different relatives in the building. Or maybe we just couldn't see them clearly from so far away. Then one day they just stopped coming. The storage building's door, which had been propped open during those weeks we saw them, was locked tight again. Months passed, and we never saw those children again. It wasn't until years later, when we were teenagers living in a different part of town, that we finally asked Mom about it. Why had she always stopped us from going over to meet those kids? Why did she always seem to know exactly when we were walking toward them? Mom got quiet for a long moment, then sat us down at the kitchen table. "Boys," she said, "there were never any children living in that building. The storage unit you saw them playing by, Mr. Hendricks, the building manager, told me it had been rented by a man who gave everyone the creeps. The other tenants complained about him constantly, said he'd scream and talk to himself all night long, that strange faces would appear in his windows when he wasn't home, moving the curtains around." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "The other residents told me that this man, who lived completely alone, somehow had children coming and going from his unit at all hours. They'd play outside until dawn, then disappear before sunrise. But here's the thing, Jake and I, none of the neighbors ever saw the same children twice. They were always different kids, different faces, different clothes. My blood ran cold as she continued. When the other tenants told Mr. Hendricks about you boys trying to approach those children, that's when they all got really worried. They said the man had never registered any children as living with him, and they'd confirmed he lived alone. That's when Mr. Hendricks found a way to break his lease early. After the man moved out, they found children's toys scattered all over that storage unit. Lots of them. But Mr. Hendricks swore the man had moved in alone and moved out alone. There had never been any real children living there. Jake and I sat there in stunned silence, remembering those late afternoons, those figures playing in the shadows, always just out of focus, always changing, always different. We realized we'd been seeing something that was meant to lure us closer, something that had been using the one thing that would definitely get our attention, the promise of friendship, the chance to finally have other kids to play with. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if Mom hadn't been watching so carefully, if she hadn't called us back every single time we started walking toward those phantom children who were never really there at all. I never believed in ghosts or supernatural things. I wasn't someone who watched horror movies or read scary stories. In fact, I actively avoided that kind of content. But what happened to me changed everything I thought I knew about reality. And now, I can say with complete certainty that there are forces in this world beyond our understanding. This took place in early 2001, when my husband Jake and I were newlyweds living in a small rental house in Millbrook, a tiny community about 40 minutes outside of Albany, New York. We'd only been married 6 months and had moved there from the city because the rent was affordable, and we wanted to start our life together somewhere peaceful. We lived in that house for exactly 1 year, and for the first 11 months, everything was perfect. It was quiet, safe, and we got along well with our neighbors. We never had any problems or strange experiences. Until March of 2002, when things began to change in ways I still don't fully understand. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of dreams. At least, I thought they were dreams at first. I started having this recurring nightmare where an elderly woman, one of our neighbors, would appear in our bedroom at night. Her name was Dorothy, and she was probably in her early 70s, a sweet lady who lived across the street with her husband. In the dream, Dorothy would stand at the foot of our bed, always on my side, holding something tightly in both hands. I could never see what it was because the room was always dark, but she'd grip it like her life depended on it. She would stand there and pray, whispering words I couldn't quite make out, like she was performing some kind of ritual or blessing. The first time it happened, I woke up feeling completely exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. I couldn't understand why. I hadn't done anything particularly strenuous the day before. I just chalked it up to a restless night and didn't think much about it. But then it happened again the next night, and this time Jake woke me up. I found myself sitting upright in bed, and he was sitting up too, gently shaking my shoulder. When I asked him what was wrong, he said I'd been talking in my sleep, saying Dorothy's name over and over, and that I seemed agitated. He asked me what I'd been dreaming about. I told him about the strange dream, how Dorothy would stand at the foot of our bed, holding something, praying. Jake said it was probably nothing, just my subconscious processing something from the day. But I felt that same bone-deep exhaustion, like I'd been awake all night instead of sleeping. The third night, I went to bed earlier than usual because I was so tired. Jake stayed up watching television in the living room. I remember going to sleep around 8 o'clock, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up completely disoriented and confused, sitting on our living room couch, staring at my husband. Jake was looking at me with this expression of fear I'd never seen on his face before. He asked me what was wrong, and I was shaking from the shock of waking up in a completely different room. When I told him I'd had the same dream again, he explained what he'd witnessed. He said I'd walked into the living room with my eyes closed, sat down on the couch with perfect posture, and just sat there silently for several minutes. Then I'd suddenly turned to look at him and opened my eyes with this startled expression. He'd never seen me sleepwalk before, and frankly, neither had I. I'd never done anything like that in my entire life. The next day, I called my parents to ask if I'd ever been a sleepwalker as a child. They confirmed that I'd never done anything like that. No talking in my sleep, no walking around at night. This was completely new behavior, and it was getting more intense each night. Around this same time, I started paying more attention to Dorothy's house during the day. I realized I hadn't seen her outside recently, which was unusual because she was always working in her garden or sitting on her front porch. The house looked different too. All the curtains were drawn, and it seemed dark inside even during the day. When I mentioned this to Jake, he told me something that made the whole situation even more unsettling. A few nights earlier, when I'd gone to bed early, he'd stepped outside to put out the trash and noticed 2 black cars in Dorothy's driveway. 2 people dressed entirely in black had gotten out and gone into the house, but he couldn't tell if they were men or women. The strange part was that Dorothy's husband had opened the door for them, but the whole house was dark except for one small room in the back, which had a dim, warm light. That 4th night, I had the same dream again, Dorothy standing at the foot of the bed, holding something, whispering prayers. But this time, when I woke up, I was standing pressed against the bedroom wall. Jake was calling my name softly, asking me to wake up, and when I turned around, I nearly collapsed from the shock. He said he'd woken up to find me standing there, facing the wall, talking to it like I was having a conversation with someone. It terrified him to see me like that, and he'd been trying to gently wake me up without startling me. The next afternoon, Jake came home from work with a worried expression. He told me he'd stopped by the local Catholic church to talk to Father Martinez, a priest he'd become friendly with since we'd moved to town. Jake came from a very religious family, so it was natural for him to seek guidance from the church when he didn't understand something. What Father Martinez told him changed everything we thought we knew about our situation. He explained that Dorothy had been receiving visits from several priests from different parishes all week. The same week my dreams had started. They'd been performing an exorcism on her since Monday, and according to the priest, it was an extremely serious case. Father Martinez said Dorothy was involved in something very dark and dangerous, something that had changed her completely. He couldn't understand why I was being affected by it, since I had no direct connection to Dorothy or whatever was happening in her house. None of the other neighbors were experiencing anything strange, and even the priests working on Dorothy's case weren't having problems. but Dorothy herself was apparently unrecognizable, both in personality and physically. Jake wouldn't tell me exactly how the priest had described her appearance, but he said Father Martinez was genuinely concerned about what was happening to her. The priest gave Jake some items for protection: holy water, a rosary, and a prayer card. He instructed us to place these things in different parts of our house, assuring us that they would keep us safe from whatever was affecting Dorothy. That night we followed the priest's instructions and said the prayers he'd given us. We also left the television on for comfort. Despite everything we'd learned that day, I was so exhausted that I managed to fall asleep relatively quickly. But that night became the most terrifying experience of my entire life. I woke up not from a dream, but from the sound of someone tapping on our living room window. Jake was already sitting up in bed, and when I looked at him, his face was white with terror. He told me he'd been awakened by the sound of laughter, Dorothy's laughter, coming from outside our house. Then she'd started tapping on the window with what sounded like her fingernails, making this slow, deliberate scratching sound against the glass. I was on the verge of tears from fear, but Jake got up, turned on the bedroom light, grabbed the holy water, and locked our bedroom door. He told me to start saying the Lord's Prayer with him, and as we prayed, he sprinkled the holy water around the door frame. We could hear Dorothy continuing to tap on the window throughout the night, this rhythmic, patient sound that never stopped. She never spoke or called out to us, just that constant tapping until sunrise, when it finally stopped. The entire time, Jake was shaking as he held the holy water, and we spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, backs against the headboard, listening to those sounds and praying they would stop. The next morning, we went straight to the church. Father Martinez told us that they had lost Dorothy during the exorcism. He wouldn't explain exactly what that meant, but he said she hadn't died, she was still in her house, but she was no longer herself. Someone or something else was in control of her now, and she was in grave spiritual danger. The priest completely supported our decision to move away immediately. He said he didn't understand why Dorothy had targeted me specifically, or how she'd managed to affect my dreams and sleep patterns, but he believed we were in real danger if we stayed. We had friends in Fishkill who helped us pack everything that same day. We moved out of Millbrook within 24 hours and never went back except to retrieve a few forgotten items, and we made sure never to be there after dark. Looking back, I still have so many unanswered questions. Why did Dorothy connect with me through dreams while the exorcism was happening? What did she want from me? What would have happened if we'd opened the door that night when she was tapping on our window? And what did she look like by the end? How had she changed so dramatically that even the priest said she was unrecognizable? Those questions haunted my sleep for months afterward, but I'm grateful we listened to our instincts and got out of there when we did. Sometimes I wonder what happened to Dorothy and her husband, whether the priests were ever able to help her, or if whatever took hold of her is still there in that house in Millbrook. What I know for certain is that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or science. And sometimes the best thing you can do is trust your fear and get as far away as possible. This happened in the fall of 2015, when my friend Jessica had just moved into her first apartment in Portland, Oregon. She'd found this great deal in an old Victorian house that had been converted into 4 rental units. The landlord had given her a decent rate because she was fresh out of college and working her first real job at a nonprofit downtown. Jessica was so excited about having her own place that she decided to throw a small housewarming party. Nothing crazy, just 5 or 6 of us from our college friend group. We were all around 24, 25 years old, finally feeling like real adults with our entry-level jobs and studio apartments. The party was going well. We'd ordered pizza. We're catching up on everyone's post-graduation lives, sharing stories about terrible bosses and overpriced rent. Jessica's apartment was on the ground floor, and it had this cool, old-fashioned layout with high ceilings and original hardwood floors. The bathroom was accessed through her bedroom, which was a little awkward for guests, but she'd hung up a curtain for privacy. Around 10 p.m., I excused myself to use the bathroom. I walked through Jessica's bedroom, trying not to look too closely at her personal stuff scattered around. You know how it is when someone's just moved in, boxes everywhere, clothes piled on chairs. I did my business in the bathroom and was walking back through the bedroom when I saw her. There was an elderly woman sitting on Jessica's bed. She looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and wearing what appeared to be a floral housecoat or robe. She was just sitting there, very upright, very proper, with her hands folded in her lap. "Oh," I said, startled. "I'm sorry I didn't see you there. Are you Jessica's grandmother?" The woman looked at me with these pale blue eyes and gave me the slightest smile. She nodded once, very formally, as if acknowledging my greeting. There was something old-fashioned about her demeanor, very dignified. "Excuse me," I said, feeling awkward about having walked through while she was there. I hurried past her and back out to the living room. "Hey Jess," I said, pulling her aside from the group. "I didn't know your grandmother was here. She's in your bedroom, should I have not gone through there? I feel bad about disturbing her." Jessica's face went completely white. "What did you say? Your grandmother, elderly lady, silver hair, floral robe. She's sitting on your bed." "Emma," Jessica grabbed my arm, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Describe her exactly." I described the woman I'd seen, and Jessica's hands started shaking. She called everyone over and, in a trembling voice, she told us something she'd been keeping to herself. For the past 2 weeks since moving in, she'd been seeing movement in her peripheral vision. She'd catch glimpses of someone walking through her apartment, especially in the kitchen area near the old-fashioned refrigerator. At first, she thought it was just the stress of moving, maybe shadows playing tricks on her eyes. But then, 3 days earlier, she'd been in the living room and had clearly seen a woman in a floral robe walk from the kitchen toward the refrigerator. When Jessica called out to her, asking who she was and how she'd gotten in, the woman had simply walked through the wall. Jessica had been trying to convince herself it was her imagination, that the stress of living alone for the first time was making her see things. But now that I'd seen her too, and described her exactly, she knew it was real. We decided to stay the night with Jessica. Nobody wanted to leave her alone, and honestly, we were all pretty freaked out. My friend Sarah suggested we try talking to the woman, maybe saying some prayers or something her grandmother had taught her about helping spirits find peace. We gathered in the bedroom around midnight. Jessica spoke first, addressing the empty room. "We don't want to disturb you, and we're not trying to make you leave your home. But if you're still here, if you need help finding peace, we want to help you." We said some prayers, lit a few candles Jessica had, and just tried to create a peaceful, respectful atmosphere. I'm not particularly religious, but there was something about the moment that felt important, like we were participating in something sacred. After that night, Jessica never saw the woman again. She lived in that apartment for 2 more years and never had another supernatural experience. Sometimes I wonder who that woman was, maybe a previous tenant, maybe someone who'd lived in the house when it was still a single-family home decades ago. But I'll never forget how real she looked, how solid and present she seemed sitting on that bed. And I'll never forget the gratitude in Jessica's eyes when she realized she wasn't losing her mind, that what she'd been seeing was real. And that sometimes, all a lost soul needs is acknowledgement and a little kindness to find their way to whatever comes next. I lived in a unique apartment building in San Francisco's Mission District, one of those quirky places where the street level changes dramatically due to the hills. My building was built into the slope, so the back alley was actually level with the 2nd and 3rd floors. I lived on the 2nd floor, which meant I could see directly into my upstairs neighbor's windows when I walked home from work each day. That neighbor was Alfred Morrison, a 73-year-old retired postal worker who'd become one of my closest friends despite our 40-year age difference. I was 28 at the time, fresh out of a bad breakup and struggling to make ends meet as a freelance graphic designer. Alfred had this wonderful way of making everyone feel welcome. He'd strike up conversations at the corner market, remember details about your life that you'd forgotten you'd shared, and always had time to listen if you needed to talk. Our friendship was built on those evening walks home from the market. I'd run into him buying groceries, and we'd end up walking back together, talking about everything from his days working for the Postal Service to my struggles with difficult clients. He had this gentle wisdom about him, the kind that comes from decades of watching people and really caring about their stories. In March of 2020, I came down with a severe case of bronchitis that knocked me flat for almost a week. The coughing was so bad that I couldn't sleep, and my throat felt like I'd been swallowing glass. My boss at the marketing firm where I just started working gave me some time off, and I decided to recuperate at my parents' house in Oakland, where my mom could take care of me properly. I was gone for about 10 days total. When I finally returned to my apartment, I was walking up the back alley, the one that ran level with the 2nd floor, when I heard Alfred's voice calling down to me. He was leaning out his 3rd floor window, waving and asking how I was feeling, whether I was fully recovered from my illness. I was touched that he'd noticed I'd been gone, though I couldn't figure out how he knew I'd been sick. I hadn't told anyone in the building about my bronchitis, and I certainly hadn't mentioned it to Alfred before I left, but his concern seemed so genuine that I didn't want to question it. Much better, I called back up to him. Though I still have this lingering cough and my throat's pretty raw. Hold on a minute, he said, disappearing from the window. Don't go anywhere. I waited by the building's side entrance, figuring he was coming down to chat. Instead, a few moments later, he reappeared at his window holding a small paper bag. Catch this, he said, carefully dropping it down to me. Inside was a collection of natural remedies, fresh ginger root already sliced, 2 lemons, a small container of honey, and some loose chamomile tea. There was also a handwritten note with brewing instructions in Alfred's careful cursive. Steep the ginger and chamomile for 10 minutes, add honey and lemon juice to taste. This is what my Helen used to make when I had chest colds. Should clear you right up. I was incredibly grateful. Alfred had always been generous, but this felt especially thoughtful. I knew his wife Helen had passed away about 5 years earlier, and he rarely talked about her. The fact that he was sharing her home remedy with me felt like a real gesture of friendship. "Thank you so much, Alfred," I shouted up to him. "This is really kind of you. Just let me know how you're feeling tomorrow," he replied. "I've got some errands to run now, but we'll catch up soon." I went upstairs and made the tea immediately. It was exactly what I needed. The ginger cleared my sinuses, the honey soothed my throat, and the chamomile helped me sleep better than I had in weeks. By the next morning, I felt almost completely back to normal. I didn't see Alfred for the next couple of days, which wasn't unusual. He kept a fairly regular schedule, but he also had a busy social life for a man his age, volunteer work at the food bank, regular coffee dates with other retirees, visits from his adult children who lived across the bay. On Thursday afternoon, I was heading to the market when I ran into him on the street. We fell into our usual pattern of walking together, and I thanked him again for the tea. "Helen's recipe never failed," he said with a smile. "She had remedies for everything." "I'm glad it helped you get back on your feet." We chatted about my work, his volunteer activities, the changing neighborhood. As we approached our building, we had to navigate through a narrow passageway between two buildings, barely wide enough for one person at a time. Alfred gestured for me to go first. "Age before beauty," I joked, but he insisted. I squeezed through the passage and turned to wait for him on the other side. He never appeared. I waited for about 30 seconds, then called his name. No response. I went back through the passage, thinking maybe he'd gotten distracted by someone else, but the street was empty. It was strange behavior for Alfred, who was always polite to the point of formality. I couldn't imagine him just disappearing like that without saying goodbye. I looked around for a few more minutes, but he was nowhere to be found. When I got back to the building, I noticed unusual activity around Alfred's apartment. His son David and daughter-in-law were there, along with another man I didn't recognize. They were moving boxes and furniture out of the apartment, loading everything into a truck parked in the alley. I knew David from his regular visits to see Alfred. He'd always been friendly, and I could tell he was close to his father. When I saw him, I walked over to say hello and ask if Alfred was moving. "Oh, hey there," David said, but his expression was odd, a mix of sadness and something else I couldn't identify. "How are you doing?" "I'm good," I replied. "Is Alfred around? I was just talking to him on the street, but he seemed to disappear." David's face went pale. He exchanged a look with his wife, then turned back to me with the most gentle expression I'd ever seen. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion," he said carefully. "Dad passed away 2 weeks ago. We're just clearing out his apartment now." The words didn't make sense. I'd just been talking to Alfred 20 minutes earlier. We discussed Helen's tea recipe, his volunteer work, the weather. He'd been wearing his usual brown jacket and the baseball cap from his old postal route. "That's not possible," I said. "I just saw him. We walked from the market together." David's wife put her hand on my arm. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I know you and Alfred were friends." The funeral was last Saturday. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. "But the tea," I said weakly. "He gave me tea when I was sick, the ginger and honey. It was Helen's recipe." Now David looked puzzled. "When was this?" 3 days ago. I've been sick with bronchitis, and when I got back from my parents' house, he dropped a bag of remedies down from his window." David and his wife exchanged another look. "Dad died on March 15th, David said gently. "He had a heart attack in his sleep. We found him when he didn't answer his phone for 2 days. I did the math in my head. March 15th was exactly 2 weeks before I'd returned from my parents' house. which meant Alfred had died while I was still sick in Oakland. But I have the tea, I said desperately. I still have the ingredients he gave me. Can you show us? David asked. I led them up to my apartment, my hands shaking as I opened the door. The paper bag was still on my kitchen counter, exactly where I'd left it. Inside were the ginger slices, now dried and shriveled, the lemons, the honey, and the loose chamomile tea. At the bottom was Alfred's handwritten note with Helen's recipe. David picked up the note and stared at it for a long moment. This is definitely Dad's handwriting, he said quietly. And this was Mom's recipe. She used to make this exact tea for him when he had chest colds. His wife was looking at me with a mixture of wonder and concern. You said he dropped this from his window, I nodded. I was walking up the alley and he called down to me, asked how I was feeling, then told me to wait while he got the tea ready. Dad always worried about people, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Even when he was sick himself, he was always checking on neighbors, making sure everyone was okay. We stood in my kitchen for a few minutes, all of us trying to process what had happened. The evidence was right there, the tea, the note, the careful instructions in Alfred's handwriting. But the timeline made no sense. I think, David said finally, that Dad cared about you more than you realized. He was always talking about his young neighbor who was struggling to make it as an artist. He worried about you, especially when you were going through that rough patch with your ex-girlfriend. I hadn't realized Alfred knew about my relationship troubles, but thinking back, I remembered mentioning it during one of our walks home from the market. He had a heart condition, David continued. Had been dealing with it for years, but he never let it slow him down, never stopped taking care of people. Before they left, David gave me something that had belonged to Alfred, a small pendant that had been a gift from his doctor friend, who'd helped him through several heart procedures over the years. Dad always said that people who care about each other don't really leave, David told me. Maybe this is proof of that. After they left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, looking at the dried ginger and the handwritten note. I made one more cup of tea using Helen's recipe, and as I sipped it, I felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with grief. Alfred had died while I was sick and vulnerable, far from home and feeling isolated. But somehow, in whatever way these things work, he'd managed to take care of me one last time. He'd made sure I had what I needed to get better, even though he was no longer alive to see it happen. I kept that pendant David gave me, and I still have it today. Sometimes, when I'm going through difficult times, I hold it and remember Alfred's kindness. I think about how caring doesn't end with death, and how the best neighbors are the ones who watch out for each other even when it's not convenient, even when it seems impossible. I never saw Alfred again after that day, but I never forgot the lesson he taught me, that true friendship transcends the boundaries we think separate us. Sometimes the most important help comes from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the people who care about us most are the ones who find a way to be there for us, no matter what. I lived in a small apartment complex in Phoenix, Arizona for a couple of years, starting in early 2018. I was 27 at the time and had just gotten a promotion at work, so I could finally afford to live alone. The complex wasn't huge, just 6 units arranged around a central courtyard, with a small pool that nobody ever used. My neighbors were mostly quiet people. There was Mrs. Rodriguez next door, a sweet woman in her early 50s who lived with her husband Carlos. They kept to themselves, but were always friendly when we crossed paths. The apartment walls were thin, typical of these older Arizona complexes built in the 70s. So you could hear conversations if people spoke loudly, footsteps, the occasional argument. Everything was peaceful until the summer of 2019, when that respiratory illness started making headlines. Like everyone else, I began working from home, and that's when I first noticed it, the coughing from next door. It started around late June. Every night, usually between midnight and 3 in the morning, I'd hear Mrs. Rodriguez coughing. It wasn't just any cough. This was a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from the very depths of her chest. The kind of cough that makes you wince in sympathy, because you can tell the person is really suffering. At first, I felt terrible for her. She and Carlos were such nice people, and with everything going on with the pandemic, hearing someone cough like that was genuinely frightening. I'd lie in bed listening to these awful coughing fits that would last for 10, sometimes 15 minutes at a time. They always happened at night. During the day, I'd hear normal sounds from their apartment, Carlos watching his Spanish game shows, the occasional conversation, but never any coughing. This went on for about 3 weeks. Some nights the coughing was worse than others, but it was consistent, always in the dead of night, always that same terrible, wet sound that made me think she must be in serious pain. I debated whether I should say something. We weren't close friends, just neighborly, but I was genuinely worried. Finally, one morning in mid-July, I ran into Carlos by the mailboxes. He was wearing a mask, of course, and so was I, but I could tell from his eyes that he looked exhausted. "Hey, Carlos," I called out, keeping my distance. "How's Mrs. Rodriguez doing? I've been hearing her cough at night, and I'm concerned. If you guys need anything, I have a friend who's a nurse practitioner. She could maybe do a telehealth visit or something." The expression that crossed his face was something I'll never forget. It wasn't anger or offense like I'd worried about. It was confusion, then something that looked almost like fear. When he started, then stopped. He looked around the empty courtyard, then back at me. "When was the last time you heard her coughing?" "Just last night, actually, around 2 a.m. Carlos, if you need help getting her to a doctor or—" "Maria died 6 weeks ago," he said quietly. "We both got sick in May. I recovered, but she didn't make it. I'm sorry I didn't tell anyone here. I haven't been ready to talk about it." I felt like the ground had shifted under my feet. "I'm so sorry," I managed to say. "Carlos, I had no idea. I'm so sorry for your loss." He nodded, tears in his eyes behind his mask. "Thank you. I should have told the neighbors, but it's been hard. I've been staying with my sister most nights. This place feels too empty without her." I offered my condolences again and hurried back to my apartment, my mind racing. If Maria had died 6 weeks ago, then who had I been hearing coughing every night for the past 3 weeks? That night I lay awake listening. Sure enough, around 1:30 a.m., it started again. That same deep, painful coughing coming from the apartment next door, the apartment where Carlos hadn't been sleeping, the apartment where Maria Rodriguez no longer lived. I never told Carlos what I continued to hear. Some things are better left unspoken, but I'll never forget those nights, lying in my bed in Phoenix, listening to the ghost of a woman's suffering echoing through thin walls, a final reminder of pain that death hadn't quite silenced. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.